Hi there. Thanks for listening. If you love Christian romance books, please check out all my series playlists and subscribe if you haven't already. Comments help push my books out to others, so feel free to comment if you'd like. With Every Breath by Mallory Ford. Book 5 in the Mountain Promise series. Chapter 1. 18 months ago. Jefferson Banks cracked his neck to one side, then the other as he made his hourly rounds of the property. The night was inky black, the firearm in his hip holster cold to the touch from the night's chill. Pulling his flashlight from the other side of his holster, he clicked the switch to illuminate the path before him. His breath clouded in front of his mouth, dampening his beard as he walked through it. The Montana Valley Women's Shelter sat on 4 acres of land, sheltered on 3 sides by the woods of Reindeer Pass. 8-foot-tall wrought iron fences guarded the fortress, but there was no sign alerting the outside world to the vulnerable women and children which slumbered in their warm beds. Rose bushes and other flowers he couldn't begin to identify lined the edges of the property, but they'd all gone dormant for the winter. The only flora still green was a few cold hardy bushes here and there. Jeff cleared his throat, the cold, dry air making it necessary to keep breathing. Nothing seemed amiss in the woods beyond the fence line, and he'd almost made it back to the guard shack when the hair on the back of his neck stood up. A career in special forces taught him to listen to his gut when it tried talking to him, and it was screaming at the moment. He'd just removed his thick hat to listen for any disturbance when the sound of a dog whining at the front gate pulled his attention. What in the world? It was well below freezing out here, and it had started spitting sleet to boot. Shoving his hat back on his head, Jeff jogged to the front gate, wondering what in the world he'd do with the poor creature when he found it. Rhonda was a bleeding heart. As the shelter director, she pretty much had to be. Maybe she'd let him keep the poor thing in the guard shack until he could find a more permanent arrangement? A new animal shelter with some cutesy name had opened in Reindeer Pass, right? It certainly wasn't toasty in the small building close to the front gates of the shelter, but it was insulated with an electric space heater to keep it far warmer than the outside air. He'd almost worked out what he planned to say to his boss when the sight of a woman and 3 young boys stopped him in his tracks. It wasn't a dog at all, but a little boy clinging to his mother's neck as tears rolled down his face and left icy streaks in their wake. All 3 boys wore coats, long pants, and shoes, though he couldn't spot a single piece of their clothing without some sort of rip or hole. The 2 older ones wore hats, while the youngest had his hood pulled up. The sight of their ragged and too small clothing sent cracks all through his once hardened heart, but it was the sight of their mother's bruised face and lack of shoes which shattered it to pieces. Please, she begged through chattering teeth as her dirty brown hair clung to her face. Please, is this the shelter? She had tear streaks of her own marring her chapped cheeks, but she spoke with strength. The sound of her voice thrust him from his earlier frozen state. Of course, ma'am. Let me open the gate. This is the Montana Valley Women's Shelter. He flashed his badge so she'd know she could trust him before turning on his heel. Sprinting into the guard shack, Jefferson slammed his hand down on the button to spur the low whine of the old gate as it opened. 2 blankets the security team used on cold nights like this one sat on the back counter, so he grabbed those as he shrugged off his jacket. Did the woman even have a coat? All he remembered was a thick sweater. The 4 of them hurried through the gate as if they feared it would slam shut on them, but it was only then he noticed the woman limped. Dread ran through his body as he thought of the state her bare feet must be in, then complete respect when he realized her oldest son wore a pair of women's boots, which were clearly not his size. She'd given her boots to her son so his feet wouldn't freeze, but what did that mean for hers? Frostbite could claim a toe in no time, but he had no intention of letting that happen tonight. Here, he said quickly as he moved to take the youngest boy from the woman. She only held the boy tighter, backing away even as she winced in pain. Sorry, you can hold him. I have blankets for you. Get it together, Jeff. You've worked here long enough to know you don't charge a wounded mama bear and her cubs. Something about this particular mother, the steely determination in her deep blue eyes, and the way she straightened her spine, even as she limped up the driveway, stirred up every protective instinct he had. One last glance over his shoulder revealed the blinking red light signaling the gate was about to close and no one had followed them through. Not that it would matter. No one would hurt this woman or her children again, at least not if he had anything to say about it. Holding up the blanket to show her it was safe, Jefferson wrapped the first wool blanket around the woman and her youngest son as they began the trek up the shelter's driveway. He handed his coat to the oldest boy before giving the second blanket to the middle one. "You're safe here, ma'am," he said as the telltale squeak of the gate signaled its closing. "My name's Jeff Banks, and you've come to the right place." Chapter 2. Summer, present day. Lauren Rafferty said as she bit her lip to hold back a giggle. "Bree? I think we've got an issue here." The poor tabby cat who'd been dropped off at the shelter that morning was clearly half-starved and mangy to boot, but there was something else likely to have her boss screaming into a pillow. Brianna Taylor, or Bree as Lauren had taken to calling her most times, jogged into the utility room they'd set up as a makeshift clinic at the Paws and Claws Animal Rescue. Truly, the name was a bit of a misnomer as they'd been known to take in far more than your typical dogs and cats. At that very moment, they also had 4 bunnies, 2 ferrets, a ball python Lauren refused to go anywhere near, 2 bearded dragons named Lucy and Ethel, and a host of dogs and cats in various stages of growth and development. How Bree managed to accumulate such a menagerie was beyond Lauren, but she'd loved working at the shelter far more than she even imagined. As a vet tech by trade before her monster of an ex-husband forced her to quit when she got pregnant with their first son, working with animals again had seemed like a far-off dream. A few months ago, when the Montana Valley Women's Shelter hosted an outing to volunteer at Paws and Claws, she'd revealed her former life and expertise. "What's going on?" Bree's brow furrowed, but at least Lauren could assuage her biggest concern. "She's going to be okay with some good food and medication, but you're about to have another litter of kittens on your hands." It didn't take an expert to see the cat would be having her babies any day, but Lauren hadn't wanted to break the news until she'd given a full exam. "Obviously, without ultrasound I have no idea how many, but she's definitely pregnant." As she'd suspected, Bree's face dropped into her hands. "Of course, she is. Because we aren't already bursting at the seams with kittens and puppies." Lifting her head, Lauren could see the bags under her boss's eyes and the stress she carried in her shoulders. "I will make it work. Get her healthy and pray we don't get any more intakes until we have a few adoptions." "You're right. It'll be okay. The animals are fed, healthy, and loved. We'll work out the rest." Somehow, despite the fact it had been years since Lauren believed God cared a thing about her, Bree's admonition to pray didn't give her the same discomfort it normally did. Everything had eventually worked out for her and her 3 boys, hadn't it? It was an awful road, one she couldn't imagine allowing children to walk if she'd had the power to fix it, but eventually they'd made it to MWS. Maybe her assurances were as much for herself as they were for Bree. Her boss nodded, taking a deep breath and squaring her shoulders. "You need to pick up the boys, right?" Her watch told her it was nearly 4 o'clock, and pickup at the Summer Arts Day camp almost all the MVWS children were attending that summer was at 4:30. "Yep, thanks for reminding me. I'd rather not get a text from Felicity again letting me know I'm late." Felicity Gunn, her surname new after she'd married her high school sweetheart earlier that year, taught theater over at the high school. She had an adorable 5-year-old little girl named Annie, the product of hers and Robert's time apart, but the 3 of them had settled into the most precious family. A group of teachers, as well as some folks from the community, had come together to put on a day camp during the months of June and July to expose kids to different aspects of the arts and hopefully spark an interest to carry over into the school year. Building an arts program was no small feat, but they'd had a fantastic turnout of late elementary and middle school kids due to their parents needing a place for them to go that summer. "Better get going, then," Bree said with a soft smile as she scratched the kitty's head. "I've got to finish the intake for this week, girl. I'll see you tomorrow." "Yep." After a year of working multiple part-time jobs she'd taken only for the paycheck, Lauren was beyond grateful for a full-time position she actually looked forward to attending every day. "I'll drop the kids off a few minutes before 9 and be in shortly after." Due to her driving right by the camp on her way to and from work, she'd volunteered to run carpool as often as possible through the summer. Gloria, Sophia's mother, was knee-deep in training for her cosmetology license and would have had to cut out early in order to make pickup. Her son, Eli, had opted out of the camp, preferring instead to continue his part-time job at Chris Poplar's equine therapy ranch in between basketball practices. As for her friend Keely's girls, Ella and Gracie, they'd fallen head over heels in love with the dance portion of the camp, practicing their choreography late into the evening after dinner every night. On her way towards the front of the shelter, Lauren squatted at the cage of her favorite dog at the shelter. "Hey there, buddy," she said as the 140-plus-pound Mastiff mix named Bruno ambled forward to sniff her. "Did you have a good day?" They were finally at a point where she'd managed to get him out of the cage and put a harness on him, so long as no other dogs were around. No other humans either. No walks yet, but it was a slow and sure process. Poor Bruno had not only been abused by his owner, but he'd also been forced into dogfights resulting in scars down his sides and a heartbreaking fear of almost everyone. Reaching in her pocket, Lauren held out a few of his favorite treats. It had taken 3 weeks after she started working there for Bruno to approach the cage door while she was still close and another 2 weeks to eat from her hand. Once he'd realized he could trust her with that, the rest started to get better. His legs still shook as he moved towards her, but there was something poetic about stepping forward in courage despite the shaking that Lauren hadn't had the mental space to fully process. Bruno pressed his head into Lauren's hand, signaling he was ready for pets. The trust was an honor she wouldn't take for granted, as she knew exactly how difficult it could be to trust again after one had been so deeply broken. The handsome face of a military veteran turned women's shelter security guard flashed in her mind, his kind patience in building their friendship not unlike her approach with Bruno. Still, while Bruno accepted her love with hesitant bravery, she didn't know she ever could. Jeff Banks was a good man, but she had 3 growing boys to think of and enough baggage to fill an airplane. None of them deserved it, as it was all her burden to carry. Standing, Lauren gave Bruno one last head scratch before moving through the door to the 15-passenger van she'd driven from MVWS that morning. There was no use crying over what might have been, especially when her marriage to Dean had given her the 3 most wonderful blessings she could have ever imagined. Jeff stared out the front window and smiled as he spotted the white 15-passenger van ambling up the drive to the women's shelter. He wasn't on duty, but he and Rhonda had finished up their weekly security briefing about a half hour before. The woman herself had been concerned about one of the new intakes who'd come to stay with them recently, but now she was all smiles on the front porch as she made faces at Frances's new baby girl and gave the new mom a much-needed break. As Jeff stepped out the front door and she spotted him, Rhonda's brow rose. "You're still here? I thought you'd gone out the back." The surprise morphed into amused suspicion, as Rhonda knew good and well what had caused him to delay his exit, or rather, who. "Just going over a few things with the guys," he said honestly. Whether those messages could have waited until tomorrow was irrelevant, as now the van had parked in front of the building and the parade of kids who'd attended the arts camp filed out. Most laughed and cut up with each other, while Gracie and Ella turned some sort of fancy ballet turn the second their feet hit the gravel drive. 10-year-old Brady flew up the steps with a wide smile on his face. "Jeff, guess what? I got to try out the drums at camp today, and Mom said I can get some when we get our own place." His heart thudded at the idea of them leaving the shelter, but it was the right thing. Usually, the program was 2 years, and Lauren and the boys had been there for 18 months. Rhonda had been known to extend it, and she'd never turn out a family in need. Lauren had worked the program beautifully. She'd worked odd jobs, but this one with the shelter using her veterinary technician training seemed to make her happier than he'd seen her since he met her. The savings accounts the shelter set up for them upon intake had also grown, as their expenses were minimal while they lived there. He only knew that because she'd told him one night when they'd sat on this very porch earlier in the summer and discussed her future plans with him. Still, as she shut the driver's side door and stepped around the side of the van with a slight shake of her head, the sight of her was one he knew he'd miss seeing every day. "Dude," he said as he high-fived Brady. "That's awesome. You gonna join a rock band one day?" 6-year-old Ben snorted. He's gotta learn how to hold the sticks first. He's trying to impress the girls. Lauren Rafferty was the most beautiful woman he'd ever seen, even when her shoulders hunched with exhaustion from the long day and her curly blonde hair had started to break free from the headband she used to pull it back. Her hair was shorter than it had been when she arrived, but back then it was clear she'd not been able to take care of it while still under the thumb of her ex-husband. Now it was above shoulder length, healthy and shiny. Her green eyes held the same shine despite her exhaustion and the slight furrowing of her brow in worry which appeared as her oldest son, Will, exited the van. I said we'll see, Brady. Let's get a few more practice sessions under your belt before we start picking out drum sets. Brady and Ben continued to bicker as they moved inside, while Gracie, Ella, and Sophia declared they'd be going over to the large shady area near the basketball court to practice their choreography. As for Will, he barely uttered a word as he trudged by, shutting the door behind him with more force than necessary. The baby cooed, and Rhonda bounced her a few times before turning her attention to Lauren. What's with Will? I have no idea. He's been surly and quiet since I picked him up, but he doesn't want to talk about it. Just then, the trill of her phone in her pocket had Lauren holding up a finger for them to wait. Oh, hang on. It's Felicity. Jeff took a seat on the steps and heard Rhonda's knowing chuckle as she settled back in the rocking chair. Lauren ran a hand over her face in frustration as she spoke in hushed tones to Felicity, but it was the lone tear he spotted trickling down her cheek which had him shooting up from the step and crossing the short distance between them in 3 long strides. Okay, yeah. Thanks for letting me know, Felicity. No, you did the right thing. I'll talk to him. Lauren hung up the phone, and 2 more tears spilled over. Heedless of the fact his boss sat feet away and her sons could well be watching from the window, Jeff pulled the woman who'd become one of his best friends into his arms. Surprisingly, she let him, and the deep breaths she took as she pulled herself together broke his heart. What's going on, honey? He'd called her honey for ages, despite the fact he had no right to. She wasn't his girlfriend, though she would be eventually if he had anything to say about it. Still, Lauren had been put through the ringer, and if she needed a friend, that's what he'd be. Tell me how I can help. Pulling back, Lauren wiped her cheek once more with a sad smile. They started on the choreography for some of the fights at the end of Summer Showcase later this month. They're apparently from West Side Story. Will had auditioned and was doing great with the initial blocking, but as soon as one of the instructors started working with him in hand-to-hand combat, he dropped to the floor and had a panic attack. The sad and understanding look on Rhonda's face likely mirrored his own. Oh man, in front of everyone. Will had been through as much as his mother, and he had nothing to be ashamed about when it came to the flashbacks and anxiety which still plagued him at times. But no 12-year-old boy wanted to have a panic attack in front of all his friends. Yeah, she said he snapped himself out of it after about 20 minutes. No one teased him that she could see, but it embarrassed him. She'd wanted to call me right then, but he begged her not to. They'd moved into running lines for their 1-act play by that time, so he was able to jump back in. Still, I know he was humiliated. It made sense. Jeff wasn't overly familiar with stage combat, but he'd seen enough shows to know it could look pretty real if done correctly. A fist flying at the kid's face would no doubt rattle a kid with his history. He wouldn't get hurt, but his fight or flight response didn't know that in the moment. He really loves theater, right? Lauren sniffed again, breaking his heart a little more. Yeah. He's been saying he wants to take drama this year at school, but at some point he's going to have to do combat, right? I would think so, Jeff said as he thought about how to best handle this. He'd only engaged in real hand-to-hand combat, but maybe he could enlist some help? How about this? The drama teacher at the middle school, Sam Lawson, owes me a favor after I helped wire his mom's house for a new security system last fall. Let me give him a call and see if he could train me on some of the finer points. Then I can work with Will to get him more comfortable. After a moment's hesitation, Lauren shook her head. I don't know if that's a good idea. What if he dash? If he breaks down with me, it's a safe place for him to do it. He trusts me, Lauren. He knows I'll never hurt him. He'd rather gouge his own eyes out than lay a hand on any one of them in anger. At least talk to him and see if he might agree to it. All of them are going to do the combat portion of the showcase, right? He didn't know anything about theater, but it would stand to reason they'd need all hands on deck for that part. Yeah, that's what Felicity said. She said he was welcome to sit out, but that's embarrassing for a kid. Jeff placed his hands on her shoulders, ignoring the way Rhonda's eyes widened slightly from her perch in the rocking chair. Let me at least try. If he says no, you have a plan B. Her eyes met his, and he couldn't help but see his whole future right there in their forest green. He wouldn't act on it, not until she was ready, but Lauren Rafferty was it for him. He'd known it the morning after she and the boys had come to the shelter, and he'd walked into the kitchen to find her and little Ben making pancakes for breakfast. She'd not recognized him in the daylight at first, and she'd chunked the ladle at his head with an impressive amount of strength. She'd already shoved Ben behind her when she spotted his badge, and her face drained of all color. Rather than let her apologize, Jeff had merely let out a bark of laughter and fell head over heels for this woman with the frostbitten feet, bruised ribs, and the heart of a mama bear when it came to her cubs. He'd gone more than a few rounds with the heavy bag at the memories of the injuries she'd arrived with. He'd loved to give Dean Rafferty a taste of his own medicine, but the man was behind bars. He'd stay there, and her divorce was finalized a year after she'd arrived. The more he'd gotten to know her, the more he'd found to like, not the least of which was her expressive face, which couldn't hide one bit of what she was thinking. Now, the debate raging within her broadcast itself in the set of her mouth and the narrowing of her eyes. All right, it's worth a try. If he says no, don't push him. Okay. The last thing anyone in this family needed was to be pushed too hard. A nudge, sure, but they had to move at their own pace or they'd tuck tail and run. You're the boss here, honey. Not me. If you think I'm pushing too hard, just give me the word. Give me a 5-minute head start to go talk to him, and then come and find us, she said with a sigh. He agreed and watched as she climbed the steps and moved through the front door. With his own heavy sigh, Jeff crossed the driveway to the steps and sat down once more, this time with pain for all they'd endured weighing on his shoulders. Be careful, Jeff, Rhonda said softly from her rocking chair. You're playing with fire here. Her warning was clear. The women came first, and if he pushed Lauren too hard, he'd be the one to get the boot. That girl doesn't need anything else complicating her life. Plus, she's still not made her peace with the Lord. She was right, and Lauren's doubts about faith in general were one of the reasons he'd held back. He couldn't date her if she still operated as a functional agnostic. That wasn't in the cards for him, and as much as it would break him, he'd have to walk away. I know. It's just, I can't control how I feel. The sound of Rhonda's clearing throat pulled his head from his hands. In his 43 years of life, he'd never met someone quite like Rhonda. She could somehow dress someone down and build them up in the same conversation, but they left motivated to do more, to be more. We rarely can. I'll tell you what I tell my boys. The heart wants what it wants, but the Bible says it can also be deceptive. You ask the Lord to guide your desires, and He'll make His desires yours too. Now, she said as she shifted baby Olivia in her arm. I think little miss and I have a date with a bottle before I have to give her back to her mommy, so I'll talk with you later. Jeff stood to help Rhonda to her feet, earning a scowl in complete communication she needed no help, and shoved his hands in his pockets. She was right. He needed to be far more concerned with Lauren's salvation than with any sort of hope for a relationship they might have. Putting the cart before the horse was destined to end in disaster. Chapter 3. Lauren dragged her pencil over the textured paper of her sketchbook, filling in Jeff's beard with hues of gray to accomplish its natural shadows and graying. He was only 43, so most of his hair still maintained the light brown it had been in younger pictures she'd seen of him, but the gray added a level of maturity and experience she'd found herself pondering more than once. The shelter's front porch was a comfortable one, but it was the back porch she loved to sketch from. Rocking chairs sat in a line, as did a few stationary Adirondack chairs, and even a porch bed perfect for afternoon naps in the summer. Just past the basketball court, Jeff and Will, engaged in the theater combat training, Will had reluctantly agreed to only because it was Jeff who'd offered. She couldn't hear them, but Will's shoulders were relaxed and his color was right. Honestly, if there was anyone she trusted her boys with, it was Jeff. He could read people like they were open books, even those like her who remained closed off with sky-high walls built brick by brick from pain and destruction. The first bricks were laid as a child the moment her father left, and she'd first questioned why he didn't love her enough to stay. Next, her mother's quick anger and understandably being overwhelmed at the prospect of single-parenting a little girl with no family support and nothing like MVWs to fall back on. Long before she ever took vows with Dean, those walls had already started their slow ascent to the heavens. All he'd done was build them up higher and solidify their purpose. Jeff and Will laughed and high-fived as they finished up a specific piece of choreography Felicity had sent over in a video. It was rough, as Jeff still hadn't brought his fist as close to Will's face as his scene partners would, but it was progress. Somehow, in the 3 days since he'd convinced Will to agree to lessons, Jeff had tracked down a friend of his and put himself through his own combat choreography boot camp. The beard in her sketch finished, Lauren moved to his eyes, the ones she'd noticed the first night they came to the shelter, and again that moment he'd walked in on her in the kitchen with Ben. She'd been dipping pancake batter from the bowl when he'd moved inside with such confidence and natural swagger it had startled her. He made an effort to make himself smaller around new women to the shelter to try not to frighten them, but there was only so much slouching the man could do. His eyes, though, with their natural mix of blue and gray, depending on the light, showed exactly what kind of man he was. Despite his years in combat, despite any hardships he and his brother had experienced as children, one could search all they wanted and only find pure goodness. The back door opened as she filled in a bit of the twinkle she often saw when he was around her kids, but Lauren didn't rush to put away the sketch. It was how she relaxed after long days at work and stress over the future. Everyone there knew she sketched people and scenes whenever the inspiration struck. It so happened images of Jeff seemed to calm her soul more than any other subjects save her children. As a result, the book was a quarter full of the man who currently allowed her 12-year-old son to pull him to the dirt with a simple leg sweep that wouldn't so much as budge him in real life. "That's beautiful," Kayla said as she settled into the rocking chair beside her. "You've even gotten the dimples." Not everyone initially saw Jeff's dimples due to his thick beard, but there was something charmingly boyish about them, a contradiction to the strength that exuded from every other part of him. "Thanks. We had a bit of a rodeo at the shelter today, so I needed some sketch time." "Oh, really? What happened?" Kayla was the assistant director and social worker for the shelter. Her boyfriend, Chris Poplar, was the assistant principal over at the high school, and the two of them had navigated a rocky start due to deception and misunderstandings to build a foundation of love and trust. Well, first, a new intake we got a few days ago had her puppies. She has taken to motherhood well, but one of the littles has had trouble getting access to nurse due to her boisterous big brothers and sisters. It's always a debate whether we should separate the mother and baby a couple times a day, let her keep trying on her own for a bit, or bottle feed her to keep her strength up. "Oh," Kayla squealed as she placed her hands on her cheeks. "I didn't know you guys had new puppies. We'll have to come volunteer again soon. We can always use extra hands." After that, one of the kittens developed a nasty case of kennel cough, and we ended up transferring her to a local vet for round-the-clock care for a few days. Then, of course, Lucy, the bearded dragon, escaped from her cage again during feeding and sent us on a wild goose chase, resulting in a spilled cup of coffee and overturned jug of pencils. Bearded dragons are mostly calm, but they can be quick when they want to be. Lucy was an escape artist. She couldn't survive in Montana's weather. She'd been born in captivity and surrendered when the owners who'd purchased her as a Christmas present realized she was more work than they bargained for. It was sad, but that was the reality of life working in an animal shelter. "Oh, goodness," Kayla said with a chuckle. "It does sound like you had a day." Her gaze went to Jeff and Will over in the grass under a large tree. "How's Will enjoying the combat training?" "So far, so good. I keep thinking he's going to panic any second, but Jeff's kept him calm." Her stomach hadn't fully unclenched since they'd started, but it was one more way in which she had to allow her children to work through some things on their own. If she stepped in every time they hit a bump, they'd never learn how to do it themselves. He's good with them, Kayla mused. All of them, but particularly your boys. He was here when you guys arrived, right? He was. A warrior on a cold, wet night who'd appeared out of the pitch darkness to provide refuge to a terrified woman with frostbitten feet and children who'd been failed by both their father and their mother. No matter how many times everyone told her she hadn't failed them, she'd gotten them out when she could. Lauren didn't know if she'd ever believe it. Yeah, he brought us inside and got us warm. It was probably Jeff's quick thinking which kept her frostbitten toes from suffering tissue damage. When Will's 2 small boots had bitten the dust nearly 3 miles from the shelter, she'd known there was no other choice but to give him hers. He was not what I'd expected when I arrived at a women's shelter, but his presence put me at ease despite being absolutely terrified. Even with the startle the next morning resulting in a near miss of him getting nailed in the face with a ladle, he'd still given her more calm than she'd experienced in the years she and Dean had been together. Of course, like most of them, her abusive marriage hadn't started out that way. He'd been charming, heaping gifts and experiences on her in a way that filled the void from the day her father had left them in his rearview mirror. He'd charmed them all, her mother included. None of his true colors showed until they'd moved to Bozeman, and he'd started to show his jealousy and isolating tendencies. By the time he'd hit her the first time, she was pregnant with Will and had left her job at the veterinary clinic. Fully dependent on Dean for everything from diapers to food and convinced he'd get full custody if she tried to leave due to her lack of a job, she'd convinced herself he'd never do it again. She didn't have anywhere to go anyway, not until years later when the woman who cut her hair slipped her the card for MVWS. She'd scrimped and saved every penny she could find in the couch cushions and from selling the boys' outgrown clothing at a consignment sale. By the time she'd managed to save enough for the 3 rideshares she'd planned to throw Dean off their trail, it was the dead of winter. The last of the rideshare drivers had been a jerk, and when she saw the ticker click above what she had left in her pocket, she'd been honest. Rather than offer her mercy based on the state of them, he'd put them out 4 miles from the shelter. At that point, they'd come too far to turn back, and Dean's violence had only escalated in the years since that first hit. No, they had to move forward, no matter the cost. Kayla stared out at Jeff and Will, a small smile lifting her lips. I'm sure. I've heard the story, but never from your perspective. I'm glad he was on duty that night. All the security guards are safe and care for the work we do here, but Jefferson. He's special. Lauren finished. He gets it. Jeff high-fived Will as he spotted Lauren rise from her rocking chair next to Kayla and move back inside. He was always aware of where she was, as though there was some sort of pull to her he was powerless against. Still, this moment wasn't about Lauren, it was about her son. Dude, I'm so proud of you. That last one, I got really close. He had, and Will had gotten more and more comfortable every time they worked through the choreography. His buddy, Sam, had been happy to help the days before, as he'd seen what went down at camp like Felicity had. Day by day, they'd all help Will overcome the mental block he had when it came to stage fighting. Thanks, Mr. Jeff. The kid beamed, but that light dimmed when something crossed his mind. Do you think it'll be enough? Will I freak out again any time it's not you I'm working with? His cheeks pinked, and the insecurity marched right back into place. Jeff pondered his next words carefully. Lauren wasn't interested in faith, but she'd allowed Will and his brothers to come to church gatherings for children and youth. Jeff himself had driven them on more than one occasion, and the whole shelter did a Bible study together 3 times a week. Let's grab some water and rest for a little bit. We can talk about it. Brows rising in surprise, Will nodded. Oh, okay. My water bottle's over here. He hurried over to where they'd sat them under an old oak tree, the same one they'd used to shade their practice, and plopped down beside the bottle. What did you want to talk about? Jeff followed, taking a swig of his own water as he sat and leaned against the tree trunk. What do you know about God? I guess, more specifically, what do you believe about him? Pastor Cam talks a lot about how he loves us, but I guess I'm not sure how with everything that happened with my dad. If I had the power to stop what happened to us and my mom, I would have. Jeff would have too. In fact, he'd give every dime of savings he had for 20 minutes with Dean Rafferty and no consequences to pull him from Lauren and his job at the shelter. The guy was in prison, though, so there wasn't anything he could do. I get that. Honestly, I agree with you. You do? Yeah, Jeff said with the smallest smirk at Will's surprise. I question how a loving God can allow a bunch of stuff in this world. I try to remember the sin isn't coming from God. It's coming from people's choices. Like he gave your family and all these others a way out with the shelter, it's your dad's choices that made it necessary. Will sat back against the other side of the tree trunk, not speaking for a long moment. What does my belief about God have to do with whether or not I'll have another panic attack at camp? Open curiosity laced his words, and maybe a little fear. Well, when I start questioning whether I'm strong enough to do something, I use my fighting words. Words the Lord has given me in Scripture about both Him and myself to build up the strength I need. Without the belief about God, though, I'm not sure how helpful any of them would be. You doubt yourself sometimes? Will's disbelief had Jeff's smirk turning into a full-blown smile. You're like, huge. Leaning forward, Jeff met the kid's eye. Gonna let you in on a secret. Everyone doubts themselves sometimes. Adults, kids, old people, military veterans, everyone. We all feel the doubt creep in, and we all have to choose what we're going to believe. Will stayed quiet for another minute. So, what are your fighting words? They start with reminding myself who God is. Scripture says He's the beginning and the end. It says He is good and loving, but also jealous and just. To believe one half without the other gives us a distorted view of who He is. If Will had been going to church longer, he might have added many folks made an idol out of their incomplete caricature of God rather than worshiping the whole of who He was, but that was a conversation for another day. Pastor Cam talked about that before. What does it mean that God is jealous? I thought jealousy was a bad thing. He swallowed loudly, his eyes cast to the dirt. My dad was really jealous anytime my mom even talked to another man. Even in a store, he'd get really mad. Yet again, Jeff had to push down the anger that bubbled. Yeah, it's not the same kind of jealousy. See, your father wanted to own your mom, but he had no right to. He didn't love her, didn't serve her, and didn't sacrifice himself for her. In a healthy relationship between a man and a woman, there can be some healthy jealousy if someone's trying to insert themselves where they don't belong, but God's is a righteous jealousy. He is the only one who deserves to be praised or worshipped, so when folks start making idols out of things and putting other stuff before God, He gets jealous. Makes sense, I guess. So you said it started with telling yourself who God was. What's the next part of your fighting words? If he hadn't already, Jeff definitely would have been smiling now at the kid's pure curiosity. Who God says I am and what He says about me because of who He is. I don't have to worry because He has me in His hand. I am loved, and I am a new creation who doesn't have to feel shame about who I've been, and ultimately I am His. Without God, I'd feel pretty hopeless, but He gives me the victory. Those are my fighting words, and I have to use them often. Will's eyes watered briefly, but he never let any spill over. Are those true about me too? They sure are, buddy. They continue to talk about what it meant to follow Jesus, to make the decision to turn from his sin and move forward in faith, but baby steps were important. Everything He did for me, He wants to give it to you too. They talked for a few more minutes, and Will agreed to try praying to God at night before he went to sleep. He already had the Bible Cam had given him when he first started going to church, and Jeff knew there was a beginner's guide tucked into the front cover. By the time they made their way to the back porch and started inside at the smell of whatever Lauren had started cooking for everyone for dinner that night, Will looked lighter than Jeff had ever seen him. Kayla still sat on the back porch, raising a brow at Jeff as he bid Will goodbye. You know, I've stayed out of it because I generally don't make a practice of sticking my nose where it doesn't belong, but I've got to ask. He'd been waiting for it eventually. Ask away. What exactly is your relationship to Lauren and her boys? Her eyes held no judgment, only concerned curiosity. With a sigh, Jeff shoved his hands in his pockets. We're friends for now. In the future, we'll see, but I'd be lying if I said I didn't have feelings for her. Her face softening even further, Kayla nodded. I thought so. Be careful, Jeff. She's fragile. They all are. For the first time since he started working there, he staunchly disagreed with Kayla Mitchell. No, they're not. They're stronger than any of us could ever imagine. Don't mistake broken for fragile. She stared at him for a moment, her eyes narrowing slightly. You know what, you're right. Still, be careful with her, with all of them. He'd made the decision months ago he wouldn't pursue anything until Lauren came to know the Lord. That was a hard line, one he wouldn't cross or it would end in disaster. I will. They mean a lot to me, even if all Lauren and I ever are as friends. Chapter 4. So what do we know about this guy? Lauren slid out of Bree's truck as her boss secured the dog kennel into its bed. He was called in by a neighbor or by the police? Bree scowled. The neighbor? Animal control would have gotten out here eventually, but they were unwilling to wait. He said he'd shoot the thing if it came on his property even one more time. She shook her head, pulling on the heavy coat she'd used to try and avoid a bite if she could. I get the farmer's angry about the dog killing his chickens, I really do, but could he not wait 2 days for animal control to come and do this the right way? It was a tough situation. Farmers made their living based on their livestock. A dog who couldn't stay off their property was a liability, and the farmer was well within his rights to shoot it. Still, the dog was likely acting out of hunger and instinct. Now, rather than waiting for the people who had the proper equipment to bring the dog in, they'd had to hop in the truck that morning to go retrieve it. Do you do this often? Lauren hadn't been with Bree when she'd done any animal call-outs yet, but she definitely had a protocol. Have to step in before animal control can get there? Bree shook her head. No, not normally. It happens once or twice a year, usually for an injured animal or one like this one who lives so far out they can't come quickly. They were nearly an hour outside of town, driving well past the ranches on the outskirts of Reindeer Pass and into even more remote land. The farmer grumbled something about the dog limping, but he said he really didn't know. In his words, she lowered her voice and spoke like someone who'd smoked for 50 years. Beast wouldn't let me get close enough to get a look. Well, hopefully we can help him out. What's the game plan here? At least it wasn't winter. Trudging around in the snow for hours to try and find a dog wasn't on Lauren's list of things she'd prefer to do that morning. Finding the thing would be more like a pleasant hike, she hoped. First, we find him. I'm about to call the farmer again and see where he likes to hang out, then we'll move in. Bree hesitated. Look, let me handle his front end if it comes to that, okay? I really can't afford a workers' comp claim if he bites you. She let out a small chuckle, but Lauren could see the anxiety behind her words. I was a vet tech for 6 years and worked at a clinic in high school before that. Don't worry about me. Honestly, Lauren was a little concerned about the possibility of being bitten, but she was more worried about Bree. In the time she'd worked for the shelter, it became clear Bree had very little money and virtually no health insurance. She'd battled through some sort of infection earlier in the summer that would have gone away much quicker if she'd gone to see Micah at the clinic. Then, she'd cut her hand on a box cutter when opening a bag of dog food and glued it back together herself. It didn't take a genius to put the pieces together, and Lauren had been desperate herself once. The shelter provided them with health insurance for the women and children, courtesy of one of the large grants left by Cam's father when he passed. From what Lauren understood, they'd keep that insurance for up to 2 years after exiting the program to give them time to secure it through an employer or privately, depending on the situation. It was an absolute lifesaver for the mothers, one thing off their plate in a world where so much felt piled on. If Lauren got bitten, provided there were no life-threatening injuries, she'd be fine. Bree? She'd let a bite get infected if it meant avoiding the doctor. As she watched her boss dial the farmer's number and massage her temples as she spoke calmly to the man, Lauren suddenly wished she was a praying woman. If she had been, it would be the perfect moment to put in a request with the Almighty. Thank you, Mr. Allen, Bree said as she clenched her eyes shut. We'll do the best we can to round him up. She paused, shaking her head once more. Yes, sir. I understand. With that, Bree took a deep breath and shoved the phone in her pocket. Let's go find a dog, shall we? It took them an hour and a half to locate the large pit mix in one of his hiding spots in a shed in the back of Mr. Allen's property. The shed was rusted up the sides and looked like a stiff wind could knock it over at any moment. Farm equipment sat inside, but their focus was on the canine who'd huddled up in a corner the second he saw them. The poor thing was half-starved despite his propensity for chasing chickens, and he'd clearly been through the ringer if some of the scars across his nose and leg were any indication. He was brown and white with clear muscle definition despite his low weight. The dog stood, half cowering and half growling at the two of them. Bree gasped, not moving toward the cowering dog yet. "Lauren, look at his hind leg." Moving a half step closer in order to see better, Lauren's heart broke at the nasty evidence of what had clearly been a bear trap of some sort on the poor thing's leg. "Oh no. You poor baby." From the looks of it, it was already infected, and it wouldn't surprise her a bit if one of the veterinarians in town decided to amputate in order to save the dog's life. The dog whimpered and backed up, maintaining a low growl despite his obvious fear. His ears are back, and he's obviously scared. "Bree, be careful. I doubt he'll let us harness him, and even if he does, he won't move. Why don't you pull the truck up and we can use the catch poles to get him in the kennel?" Catch poles were long sticks with ropes on the end that could be tightened around the dog's neck. They kept the animal from lunging at whoever was trying to capture it while still maintaining control. "Yeah, I'll do that. Stay right here and try not to get bitten. Do you have treats in your pocket?" "Always," Lauren said with a grin as she knelt down a safe distance from the animal. "How else do you think I always win them over?" Bree smirked and shot one last wary glance toward the dog. "Okay, I'll be right back." With that, she backed out of the shed and took off in a run as soon as she was far enough away from the dog it wouldn't make him feel threatened. "Okay, big guy," Lauren said as she pulled a treat from her pocket. "Here's the thing. We're here to help you, and I really don't want you to run away." She tossed a treat towards the dog, and after an initial jerk backwards, the beast hesitantly sniffed it. His hunger won out, and he quickly gobbled it up. That's it. Want another? They continued like that for the 10 or so minutes it took Bree to get back with the truck, but at least he'd gotten some food in his belly. His ears had come up as well. Maybe they'd get him in the truck with no bite marks after all. He's clearly a fan of these two. Bree snorted, noting the bag of Lauren's secret weapon she'd used to win Bruno over as well. "Aren't they all?" "I have the catch poles, but do you think he might follow you on his own?" The poles would most certainly break the small amount of trust Lauren had built with the treats, but the kennel probably would too. "We can try, but be ready to move in if he makes any sudden moves." "Got it," Bree said as she bit her lip with clear anxiety over the whole situation. No one relished capturing a scared dog, especially not one of this size and breed. He'd clearly been mistreated, resulting in a well-earned distrust of humans. Together, they moved forward slowly, Bree staying far enough back to try not to startle him. Lauren continued forward with her treats, tossing them slowly but surely towards the dog. She couldn't maintain a crouched position and move, so she did her best to lean forward and try not to intimidate the poor thing further. Pulling the rope leash out of her pocket, Lauren had almost gotten close enough to the dog to try and put it on when his entire demeanor shifted. Suddenly, his ears flattened once more, and he turned angry eyes on the two of them. No, not angry, scared at the sight of the catch pole and rope leash. Lauren let out a loud sigh and jerked her head upwards at Bree, the latter moving in as she'd read the situation as well. "Back up, Lauren," Bree said as the dog lunged. The adrenaline pumping in her veins didn't immediately register the pain in her shin until Bree grabbed the dog around the neck and shoulders with one arm and bopped him in the nose with the other. When that didn't immediately work, Bree stuck her thumb into the sensitive flesh inside the poor thing's nose, and he immediately released the vice grip he'd had on Lauren's shin. The first sensation she registered wasn't even pain as she watched Bree pull the catch pole's cord tight around the dog's neck and use far more muscle than one would have thought possible with the woman's slight frame and pulled him towards the truck. A man in jeans, boots, and a faded plaid shirt Lauren assumed to be the farmer stood by the truck to help her hold him while she muzzled him and lifted him into the kennel. No, pain wasn't the first sensation. It was the drip of blood running down her leg as Lauren looked down to see the bright red rivulets draining into her sock and shoe. It puddled on the ground, and it was only then Lauren registered the throbbing, excruciating pain she'd only experienced during the births of her children. Even all the injuries she'd received from Dean hadn't hurt this much, and she clenched her teeth to keep from crying out. Bree barely spoke to the farmer as she raced to the driver's side and kicked up a plume of dust, pulling the truck the remaining 10 feet to the shed. "Lauren," she shouted as she hopped out once more. "We've got to get you to the hospital. Can you walk at all?" It was as though the blood glued her foot to the ground for all the ability she had to move it in that moment. Or maybe her brain refused to connect fully to the muscles there in her shock. "I don't know." Bree's face drained of color as she hurriedly approached and got a good look at the puddled blood. "Mr. Allen?" Bree tossed the words over her shoulder without looking back. "Can you help me get Lauren to the truck?" "Sure thing, kid," the man grasped. "I already called my wife, and she's on her way out with a dressing for that bite, but it'll be a few minutes before she gets here. Not sure it's wise to wait." The blood oozed rather than gushed with the beats of her heart, a good sign the dog hadn't hit a major artery. But then, Lauren wasn't exactly familiar with the anatomy of beings with 2 legs rather than 4. "Let's just go. The hospital's a ways in, and it'll take the ambulance too long to get here." How she'd gotten the words out, she had no idea, but the next thing Lauren knew, she and Bree were flying down the road in the truck towards the hospital while Bree called Micah Kane to meet them there. Yeah, she's still conscious, but a little woozy. An understatement, as the edges of Lauren's vision had already started to cloud, but she didn't have the energy to respond as the adrenaline wore off and the pain set in. Though, as the bleeding started to slow, it didn't look like the dog had taken a chunk out of her leg. Maybe, if nothing else, the boys would love seeing her stitches. "Yep," Bree said as she pulled up to the large overhang with the bright red emergency lights blazing despite the sunshine. When had they arrived? Had Lauren fallen asleep? "It's us." Lauren briefly registered both Micah and Harper busting through the doors of the emergency room with a host of other medical personnel and a stretcher covered in a thick plastic sheet. It was on wheels, and they brought it to a quick stop outside the truck's door as Bree slammed on the brakes and put the truck in park. Micah's kind face and calm demeanor appeared in the doorway as he reached over to unbuckle her seatbelt. "Hey, there, Lauren. I hear you had a run-in with a puppy this morning." With a chuckle devoid of mirth due to the pain coursing through her leg, Lauren nodded. "I'd say so." Harper helped Micah lift her out and get her situated on the stretcher before smoothing her now sweaty blonde curls away from her forehead. "I'll take pictures of it while we stitch it up to show the boys if you want," she said with a wink. "So they know how tough you are." Chapter 5. "All right," Rhonda said as she started to wrap up the weekly meeting between Kayla, Jeff, and herself. "I think that's everything on my end. Jeff, other than the extra cameras you mentioned around the perimeter of the property, do you have any other security concerns you'd like to see addressed?" After Francis Redmond's husband had gotten inside the gates and far too close to his then pregnant wife, Jeff had done everything he could to beef up security. Still, it wasn't until Cam's donations started coming through that winter they'd been able to add extra motion, activated floodlights, higher gates, and a security system to rival the Pentagon. "No, I think that's everything for now. Did either of you have any?" Kayla shook her head as her phone trilled in her pocket. "I don't think. Why would Bree be calling?" Jeff's heartbeat picked up, knowing Lauren was at paws and claws that morning working a shift. The kids were mostly at the arts camp, and the women save Francis were all at work. As quiet as it was as Kayla answered Bree's call, Jeff wondered if the women could hear his pulse rate as his heart thumped against his ribs. "Wait, Bree, you're cutting. What? Is she okay?" Jeff shot up from his chair as Kayla's eyes flashed to his, the concern there telling him everything he needed to know about who was on the other end. "Let me talk to her." His voice was low, far harsher than he ever used with any of the women, but in the moment he couldn't rein it in. Had Dean somehow received parole? Had he escaped from prison and decided to finish the job he'd started 18 months ago? Heat flowed through his body like lava in his veins as Kayla handed him the phone, only for him to lift it to his ear and realize what spotty reception Bree had on the other end. "Farmer." And he got bleeding ear The service was so bad Jeff didn't even try to wait for her to reach something better. "I'll be there in 15 minutes. At least, they would if they went the speed limit." Tossing the phone back to Kayla, Jeff pulled his keys from his pocket and had crossed the MVW's lobby before Rhonda and Kayla even rose from their seats. "Jefferson," Rhonda said as she finally recovered from the shock and confusion of the call. "Wait, one of us needs to come with you." "Only if they can be in my truck in the next 10 seconds, he growled. Never in his life had he been so short with a woman, especially not within these walls where so many of them were wounded by men unable to control their anger, but this was different. Lauren was in the emergency room, bleeding due to the actions of some man. A farmer? Was that what Bree said? Rage ran hot down Jeff's spine at the thought of any man laying a hand on her after everything she'd been through with Dean, but he'd deal with the man later. At the moment, as he swung open the front door and jogged down the steps to his truck, the only thoughts he registered were ones of making sure Lauren was okay. He briefly heard Kayla's footsteps and the sound of her flinging open the passenger door as he turned the key and his truck roared to life. But she didn't say anything as he peeled out down the driveway and nodded briefly in thanks to the on-duty guard who hastily opened the gates. She still didn't speak as they flew down the road to the county hospital, the one where Micah and Harper both worked. If she was concerned about her own safety, he wouldn't have noticed, as all he cared about was getting to Lauren as quickly as humanly possible. He'd see for himself she was okay, get the story from Bree, and then he'd worry about the rest. If he'd ever doubted his feelings for Lauren before, he wouldn't anymore. In every other situation, even the one with Francis's husband and Harper stepping in, he'd been able to act with rational thought in line with his extensive training. At the moment, though, he'd tear down walls to reach the woman if a soul tried to keep him away. 9 minutes later, 6 minutes faster than it should have taken, but still far too long in his estimation, they reached the parking lot at County and Jeff barely got the truck in park before ripping his keys from the ignition and moving towards the doors. He'd almost reached the sliding doors outside the ER when Kayla grabbed his arm. "Jeff, wait. If you go barreling in there like you're on fire, they're going to call security. You know this. Let me call Harper, and she'll get us back quicker than if you get tackled or tossed." She was right, and as much as he hated to waste even a moment, barging in there in his current state would definitely get him detained. "Call," he croaked out as images of Lauren when he first met her washed over him like ocean waves before a massive storm. Pressing the phone to her ear, Kayla nodded and spoke softly, Harper's reception clearly much better than Bree's. "She's coming out to get us now. We'll meet her in the waiting room." The vice around Jeff's lungs seemed to loosen a little, but he still wouldn't get a full breath until he laid eyes on the woman who'd come to mean more to him than anyone ever had. He nodded curtly, afraid if he spoke again he'd lose what little control he had left on any rational thought. Why had they gone out to a farm without someone with them anyway? Or had some farmer come into the animal shelter? Scenarios went wild in his mind despite the fact he was trained to know better than to jump to conclusions. Harper flashed her badge at the keypad on the wall, pushing open the double doors which led to the emergency room bays. There used to be a half wall there, but they'd managed to find the funding to turn it into a whole wall after they realized the flaw in their poor design choice. Yet another security risk Stuart Redmond, Francis's husband, exposed in his quest to control his wife and claim his child. "She's a little loopy," Harper said softly as they passed the closed curtains of the first 3 bays. "The medicine we gave her will probably make her sleep well tonight, but I'll come check on her in the morning before I come into work." A voice he hardly recognized ground out of him. "What happened?" Finally, Harper stopped at a bay and pushed open the long blue curtain. The sight he saw there took what little control he had left and snapped it. Lauren's leg was bandaged from her ankle to above her knee, and blood stained both her clothing and Bree's. He couldn't even tell if she was wounded anywhere else due to all the blood, but the worst part was the dirty tear tracks staining Lauren's beautiful face. Her blonde curls stuck out in all directions, like she'd run 10 miles and sweated through them, but her normally fair skin was far paler than it should be. How long he stood there staring at her, the volcano in his body bubbling to the surface, he didn't know. By the time he came to his senses, he realized he'd not gotten the answer to his question. What happened? It wasn't a question, despite being phrased as one. Tell me. Now, whether he'd directed the words at Bree or Lauren, he didn't know, as both women's eyes went wide as Lauren's mouth dropped open slightly. Excuse me? Her words were slightly slurred, but she had enough wherewithal to flash defiance in her big blue eyes. You want to try that again, big guy? Kayla's lip quirked up beside him, and his would have too at the strength the woman had found deep within herself since coming to live at MCS. There was no way she'd have spoken to Dean that way, and she'd been scared of her own shadow for months after arriving in Reindeer Pass. Jefferson's been worried about you, Kayla said calmly. I thought he was going to break a land speed record getting us here. With the fire in her glare softening a little, Lauren settled back on the bed. A farmer called this morning with a stray dog on his property. Animal control was going to take days to come out, and he said he'd shoot it if it wasn't gone today. Ready to tear the place apart to find the guy, Jeff spoke without thinking. Give me a name. It wasn't until Lauren flinched he realized he'd shouted, something he'd vowed never to do with any woman, especially this woman. Lauren, his voice softer now, but only due to the grit and gravel it felt like he spoke through. Honey, I'm sorry. No, she said as she sat up straight in her bed. First, it was a dog bite, Jeff. A scared, abused dog who is used to constantly having to fight for his life. Second, I promised myself any man who ever yelled at me again would see the door in their next breath. Get out. With that, she pointed to the curtain behind him. Situational awareness told him others had gathered behind him. Probably security, from the sound of their shoes scuffing on the floor. Lauren, I'm sorry. A dog. Of course, it had been a dog bite. Why hadn't that even occurred to him in the entire drive here? Please, Dash. No. I said get out. I'll talk to you at the shelter, but right now, I'm on far too much medication, and my leg hurts too much to deal with this. A heavy hand landed on his shoulder, and he turned to find Micah Kane indeed flanked by 2 armed security guards. Come on, man. You can wait for Kayla outside. Micah Kane was a healer, one madly in love with his wife Sarah, but these women were his friends. Jefferson had no doubt that if he didn't comply, all 3 of the men before him would do their best to haul him out. Yeah, Jeff said as his heart nearly cracked in 2 at the thought he'd shouted at Lauren. The way she'd flinched, his own anger the culprit, it would haunt him forever. Yeah, I'll go wait in the truck. Micah followed him out, at some point apparently waving off the guards. Jefferson, I've known you for how many years now? He didn't wait for the answer, so Jeff didn't supply him one. 6, since you moved here to work for Rhonda? Maybe 7? It was 8, but Jeff still didn't trust himself to speak. In all that time, Micah continued. I've come to the shelter to help with all kinds of things. He had, and Jeff had often assisted if Harper wasn't there to help. He also accompanied intakes to the clinic when they needed to be seen for their injuries alongside Kayla or Rhonda, mostly for imaging if Micah decided they could use them. I've never once seen you lose it, man. You're like a brick wall, solid and steady. The sight of blood on Micah's scrub top, the blood Jeff was pretty sure was Lauren's, drew his gaze. Somehow, despite the reality of the situation, Jeff managed to grunt. It's different with her. The same hand that had landed on his shoulder from behind in the bay now came back, this time softly as Micah's voice pulled his attention upwards once more. When Sarah almost got shot in the woods, I nearly lost my mind. Every time they hurt her, all I wanted was revenge, but it was never what she needed. She didn't need me to protect her, not really. She needed me to give her the strength she needed to protect herself. You didn't see Lauren the night she came to the shelter. Jeff had. It would be burned in his mind forever. For all the conviction he'd had with Rhonda earlier telling her Lauren wasn't fragile, he was having a hard time believing it himself after the sight of her in that hospital bed. Today, I thought. I know what you thought, Micah finished. The whole ER knows what you thought, but you were wrong. Now you're going to have to fix it. You just broke her unbreakable rule, Banks. Now it's up to you to figure out how to fix it. Chapter 6. Lauren sighed as she stared up at the steps leading into MVWS. They'd never seemed so tall before, their dark brick and weathered grout a sign of home. Her shin throbbed as she settled herself on the ground beneath them as Bree rounded the shelter's truck. "I don't think it's a great idea for you to navigate these on your crutches. Let me get Dash." "No, I can do it." If there was one driving force in Lauren Rafferty's life, it was stubbornness. Too stubborn to listen to anyone who'd pointed out Dean's red flags. Too stubborn to admit she'd drastically misjudged him. Fear too stubborn to leave until she learned of the shelter here. Now she'd found some of the strength she'd buried so deep, too stubborn to let anyone hold her back from a better future for her and her boys. "The boys will be back from camp within the next hour. I want them to know I'm fine even with the crutches." With a deep sigh, Bree nodded. "Yeah, okay. Listen, Lauren, about the bill from the hospital. Send it to me once you get it. I'll pay you while you're out, of course. Send me any bills for your follow-up PT." The pinch of skin between Bree's brows told Lauren exactly how little margin the shelter had for such expenses. "I doubt it'll cost me anything," Lauren said as she began the slow charge towards the steps. "Our insurance is pretty good through the shelter, and the hospital billing department has worked with our folks in the past." That much was true, but the first part wasn't strictly accurate. Of course, it would cost something, but Lauren had some savings she'd been collecting for once she and the boys left the program. She could cover a small amount without making too much of a dent. Bree already spent every dime she had on the shelter, and Lauren had seen the check stub her boss cut herself once on the desk. She paid herself barely more than she paid Lauren despite her seniority, and Lauren knew she'd seen Bree purchase pet food and supplies with her personal credit card more than once. "Well, if it does, send it to me. Now, let's get you up these steps and comfy on the couch before the boys come back." Bree pasted on a fake grin, but Lauren didn't push her or try to reassure her further. Honestly, her leg hurt, and she could think about the rest of it later. The medicine also made her groggy, but at least they'd changed her bandages once more before she left the ER, so the boys wouldn't see the blood Jeff had seen when he barreled into the bay. As if her thoughts conjured him, Jeff rounded the side of the shelter and froze. His normally larger-than-life presence, the one he did his best to diminish when in the presence of skittish women, was simply a shadow of its normal brilliance. "Lauren, I didn't know you'd been released." "Just happened," she grunted as she focused on the steps once more. Allowing Bree to take her elbow, Lauren planted the crutches on the first step before thinking better of it. Foot first? Or crutches first? Before she could think it through too much, Jeff, the one who'd broken one of the cardinal rules she had for her life moving forward, had closed the distance between them and swept her up in his arms. "I know you're angry with me," he grumbled as they started up the steps. "You have every right to be." Was that his heartbeat she could feel through his t-shirt? It was only on closer inspection she realized the shirt he wore bore signs of sweat. "Sorry about the smell too," he said softly as Bree hurried up ahead of them. "I was working out some of the frustration on the heavy bag Kayla put downstairs." Kayla was passionate about boxing and self-defense, two things she utilized in the therapy program for the women and children who lived there. Part of Cam's donation had given them enough to purchase a bit of used exercise equipment from online marketplaces, and the sporting goods store in town had donated the rest. It meant they didn't have to use the high school gym for their classes anymore unless she opened the class to the town at large. Those classes brought in more revenue for the shelter, and they'd periodically paid to fix and replace things to make the grants and donations they'd received stretch further. "Feel better now?" Jeff stepped through the door Bree held open for them, but he didn't immediately set Lauren down to walk on her own. When had Bree even taken her crutches from her? She'd been so distracted by the man who'd lifted her as though she weighed nothing she hadn't noticed. "You can put me down, by the way." He didn't speak for a moment, not until they reached the couches in the lobby. Why was no one around? Had they made themselves scarce, or was it a simple coincidence? Only Bree followed them, and even she hung back as though she wasn't quite sure what to do. Setting Lauren on the couch, Jeff grabbed a pillow from the end to prop up her leg. Once he did that, the larger-than-life man knelt to the ground and bent until his eyes were level with hers from her perched position. The dark gray eyes she'd never seen on anyone else filled with earnestness as he ran a hand over his face. "I'm not asking you to forgive me," That's completely up to you, but I'm so sorry. Seeing you in that bed. Thinking some farmer had done that to you, I let my imagination get the better of me, and I jumped to conclusions. Then, at your most vulnerable, I yelled at you and made you feel scared. Were those tears she saw in the corners of his eyes? His breaths were ragged as they sat there for a moment, and it was only then Lauren realized Bree had set her crutches next to the couch and apparently left. You didn't scare me, Jeff. You startled me. I know you'd never hurt me, but I promised myself I'd never let myself be yelled at like that again. It wasn't the whole of her promise to herself, but Jeff would never in a million lifetimes lay a hand on her in anger. That, she knew with no doubt. He nodded, staring at the floor as he spoke. I know, and you didn't deserve it. I wasn't even really yelling at you, but that is no excuse. It's my fault, and I'm so sorry. Her eyes narrowed, memories flooding back of the early days with Dean, the days before he'd escalated to physical abuse. When Dean used to yell at me, he'd act like it never happened. No apology until the first time he hit me, but the yelling? He'd convince me it didn't go down like I thought. I started to doubt myself, doubt my reality. I thought I was going crazy, especially once I got pregnant with Will. Her oldest, Wilson, had asked everyone to call him by his nickname earlier that summer. Apparently, it was cooler. Unable to take his defeated posture anymore, Lauren reached out to lift his chin. Never in a million years would he admit his wrongs, and even his later apologies were basically blame shifting. You didn't scare me, Jeff. You don't scare me. I know you're not like Dean. It was only then the tears she thought she'd seen in his eyes earlier spilled over onto his cheek. Her gaze followed their track until they disappeared into his beard, the one that somehow made him look even safer than her clean-shaven ex-husband. But you'll never raise your voice at me again, not if you want to continue to be in my and my boys' lives. He nodded, and Lauren breathed a sigh of relief when he reached up to dry the moisture on his cheeks. They weren't together, probably never would be due to her inability to let herself go there with someone. Not to mention, they had wildly different religious beliefs. As odd as it sounded, she had no problem with Jeff and the other staff at the shelter teaching her boys about God and the Bible. Everything they taught was good, the lessons based in good character, kindness, and love. Still, it was as though a wall had erected around her heart. Nothing, not even the supposed God of the universe, could get through. With walls like that, Jeff wouldn't stand a chance. Thank you, he croaked as the low whine of the shelter's gates opened outside. Sounds like the hooligans have come home, Lauren said with a smirk. A bit of the normal twinkle returned to Jeff's eyes, at least the twinkle he always had with her and her boys. I guess it's time to pull out the photos Harper sent me so I can show them how tough I am. Reaching up, Jeff cupped her face with his hand and ran a thumb down her cheek quickly before dropping the contact. Trust me, honey. They know. Jeff, Lauren growled 3 days later as she swatted him away again at the top of the shelter steps. I've told you, I want to do it myself. For the last 3 days, ever since Lauren had come home from the hospital with her injured leg, Jeff had taken to carrying her up and down any staircase she needed to travel. At this point, it was infuriating to Lauren, but Kayla, Rhonda, and the rest of the women at the shelter found the whole thing hilarious. Their daily bickering over whether or not she could manage certain tasks herself had become comic relief in an otherwise difficult situation. That morning, Kayla and the shelter's part-time employee, Serena, knelt in the garden beds pulling weeds. Both women watched with grins on their faces. Serena was young, her mother a graduate of the program herself, and studying to be a social worker via online classes. She'd dyed her hair pink, something Jeff couldn't really understand, but the look suited the 21-year-old spunky ball of sunshine. Come on, honey, Jeff pleaded. She'd complied the first day or two, but it was obvious he was about to get a crutch upside his head if he didn't quit babying her. Still, he couldn't help himself. Every time she winced, every time the crutch even looked like it might slip out from under her, his heart stopped. Let me help for a few more days. Micah said you'll be off the crutches at the end of next week, right? He already knew good and well what day and time her follow-up appointment was at Micah's clinic, and he planned to take her regardless of what she had to say about it. Lauren's eyes narrowed, and she took a deep breath. Jeff, how do you think I get down these steps when you're not here? Try as he might, Jeff couldn't be there 24/7. Ever since the accident, he'd taken to putting himself on the schedule every day and often stayed until Lauren and her boys went to their room for the night. That meant waking up at 4 o'clock in the morning after not getting home and in bed until past 10 o'clock every night, but it was worth the copious amounts of coffee to ensure Lauren didn't try to do too much and bust her stitches. Nice try. I'm always here. Kayla snorted into the rose bushes, and Lauren glared at both her and Serena's giggles as though they had somehow betrayed her. Come on, a few more days. We can talk about it after the weekend. It was Friday, and as angry as she was at his hovering, at least they'd managed to get past his massive mistake from the hospital. He still thought about it occasionally, wincing at the way he'd raised his voice at her, but there was nothing he could do to change it. Cam always said we often hold sins against ourselves far longer than the Lord or anyone else holds them against us. Doing that, it cheapens the gift of forgiveness. He'd spent a good deal of time on his knees over the past 18 months regarding Lauren Rafferty and the chokehold she seemed to have on his heart. First and foremost, she had to surrender her life to the Lord. Sure, he wanted a relationship with her, but he longed for her to find the peace only God could give more than anything. Fine, she replied with an eye roll. Come Monday, I'm doing this on my own. My boys need to see their mother's not helpless even when she's knocked down. His words from a few days before sprang to his mind, the ones he'd whispered in the lobby before her boys got home and saw their mother's injury the first time. Trust me, honey. They know. Her eyes swung to his, and he had no doubt she remembered the conversation as well as he did. By the time he put her down at the bottom of the steps, the gates opened to Rhonda pulling the 15-passenger van full of kids from the art camp through the gate. As always, Brady hopped out first, waving his drumsticks in the air. Hey, Jeff. Hey, Mom. Jumping to high-five both of them, even though it wasn't really necessary, Brady hurried up the steps. Ask Will about combat practice today. Jeff's gut tightened, but it calmed again when Will climbed out of the van with a smile on his face. They'd been working together almost daily since they'd started, and the kid had come so far in conquering his well-founded fears. Well, I did it, Will said with a wide smile. I got through both scenes we're planning for the showcase. They're a little rough, and everyone else is still ahead of me on their timing, but I did the whole thing and didn't freak out. Lauren hobbled forward on her crutches, pulling her eldest son into an awkward hug. Oh, I'm so proud of you, baby. You are so much stronger than you know. Her voice was thick, but Jeff noticed her quick swallow of the tears before she let them spill over. Will took her arm, balancing her the way Jeff would have normally. How are you feeling today? Did Dr. Kane say when you can go back to work? This kid was pure gold. He knew how much fulfillment his mother got from her work at Paws and Claws, but he also worried she'd push herself too hard. Jeff could relate. I have to wait until after my follow-up appointment at least, but I'm hoping to make it back then. Jeff didn't add his opinion she should take another week no matter what Micah said, as that probably wouldn't go over well yet. They could cross that bridge when they came to it. Okay, Will said. Do you need any help with anything? Eli asked if I could play basketball with him when we got home, but I can help if you have stuff you need to do. Lauren smiled softly, pressing a kiss to her son's thick blonde hair. No, baby. You go on and play. I love you. As she watched him bound up the steps after his brothers and the rest of the kids, Lauren sniffed. I'm so proud of him. It was more than the combat training. Jeff knew that much without her having to elaborate. You should be, honey. You should be. Chapter 7. Mama, Ben shouted as he pushed through the heavy oak door of MVWS the next Tuesday morning. It's hurt. Heedless of her still sore leg and Micah's desire she stay on crutches for the next 3 days, Lauren shot to her feet from her perch on the lobby's comfortable couch. Hanging out in the bedroom she shared with all 3 boys until she could go back to work would be depressing, and she could flip through home decor magazines just as well from the couch as she could from her bed. What's hurt, buddy? Before she even finished the sentence, an odor so pungent it could send even her wild curls standing straight wafted from her son to her nostrils. Oh my goodness, Serena shrieked from the front desk. What is that? A fluff of black and white fur wiggled in Ben's arms, and the pieces fell together as Lauren hobbled his way. Benjamin Lucas Rafferty, please tell me you did not bring a skunk inside this house. The poor little thing let out a squeak, and Ben's face drained of color. I didn't think about the smell part. The front door opened again, and Jeff moved through before stopping short with hand over his nose and his eyes watering. Oh man, is that a skunk? His watery eyes shot to the creature in Ben's arms, then to Lauren's face. Her mouth hung wide open still, that much she knew. Come on, bud. Let's take this little guy out to the porch. I'm guessing he's another rescue. As Lauren had as a child, Ben had a habit of bringing home small critters who'd been hurt for his mother to fix. Unfortunately, most of the time there was simply no helping them, but he still tried every time. Lauren had been forced to break his little heart more than once as she held him close and explained to him some injuries made it even more dangerous for an animal to keep on living. Okay, Ben said as a tear spilled over onto his little cheek. You can take away my video game privileges for a month, Mama. Can you try to help him? As if there was any way she could say no to that. Let me get my bag and I'll see what I can do. Don't forget your crutches, Jeff added with a smirk. He'd backed off a tiny bit since last week, but only slightly. There was no way he'd let her go all 20 feet to the front porch without her crutches without express permission from the doctor. The irony of it all should have made her skin crawl, but she knew Jeff's was at least from a place of care and concern rather than a desire to control. I'll set up a spot for you to sit and examine the patient. Lauren rolled her eyes, but she did so with a small smile. Be there in a second. With that, she turned back to the couch to grab her crutches. The last thing she registered before the click, click, click of the pads on the floor sounded was Serena rushing around to open windows and turn on the ceiling fans. Pretty pungent, isn't it? Serena nodded, her cheeks a little green as she shoved her entire upper body out one of the side windows. Understatement of the century. By the time she made it outside, Ben sat on one of the porch steps cradling the little fluff ball to his chest. Jeff carried one of the rocking chairs off the porch and down to the driveway where he gestured to a large brick planter with a wide enough border the skunk could lay there safely. Will this work? I think so. Jeff watched closely as Lauren placed both crutches in one hand and used the stairs railing to more or less hop down them, but he didn't intervene. She could have sworn she saw the sheen of sweat on his forehead with his brow furrowed, but he didn't say a word. Once she'd reached the ground, Lauren placed her crutches back under her arms and closed the distance to the chair. Okay, Ben. Let me see the patient. Where did you find him? He was just outside the fence line, near the garden beds. He was doing this awful squeal thing like that baby bunny we found on the trail a few months ago. I know I shouldn't have picked him up, but he looked so sad. Ben's lower lip trembled as he slowly moved the now happily cooing adolescent skunk to the cool brick. There was a spot of blood on Ben's shirt, but Lauren quickly found the culprit. Jeff, help hold him down while I get this burr out of the poor guy's foot. Benny, do you see how he's smaller than most of the skunks we see when we go hiking? He's likely not full grown yet. I imagine wherever you found him wasn't far from his den. Lauren did her best to quickly and painlessly remove the burr from the skunk's foot without getting sprayed. Keep petting him, Ben, but don't get downwind. That's it. Somehow, she managed to remove the thing without getting sprayed, but pressing the disinfectant-soaked cotton ball to the skunk's foot proved too much. He'd probably emptied most of his spray glands already, but still a small puff of foul-smelling odor came out once more. Jeff gagged, but Lauren and Ben managed to maintain composure long enough for her to spread a little wound glue across the sensitive spot on the skunk's pad. There, I think he'll be good because that stuff dries in seconds. Take him back to where you found him. I bet his mother is nearby and she's very worried. Ben nodded quickly, carefully sweeping the little thing close to his chest to keep it from growing too scared. Thanks, Mama. You're the best. He wrapped one little arm, his tiny arms reminding her of the baby he'd once been, around her neck and pressed a kiss to her cheek. He was her last child, the one who reminded her most of herself as a child. Penny for your thoughts? Jeff held out a hand to help Lauren to her feet as Ben and the skunk scampered away. You look a million miles away." How to put it into words when she didn't really even understand it herself? There's something healing about the fact he still has so much of his innocence despite all he's been through. It makes me feel like I didn't mess all of them up for life. Jeff reached out and took her chin between his thumb and forefinger. "You didn't mess them up, honey. You got out as soon as you could. That kid? He's going to know his mama did whatever she could to keep him safe. Brady's going to remember the walk you guys took in the bitter cold and snow, and Will's going to remember how you gave him your boots when his wore out. They know how much you love them, Lauren. They'll be okay." "I can't believe you remember the boots." Why was her voice so breathy? "It was one of the first things I noticed about you." There was more swirling around in his dark brown eyes, but he didn't say anything else. It was just as well. There was still the wall of religion between the two of them. His faith was so important to him. She'd never begrudge him that, but she couldn't share it. "When I was a kid," she said softly, "I used to bring animals home to my mother to try and rehabilitate. It never went well, and I was very much a latchkey kid due to her being a single mother, but I did my best." She'd never shared much about her childhood with Jeff, but the loneliness she'd felt gave context to why she'd fallen for someone like Dean in the first place. It was clear in the way his eyes widened. Jeff hadn't expected her to. "Your mom was a single mom?" "Yeah. She worked long hours at a local convenience store, smoking to try and find some hit of happiness in an otherwise exhausting and depressing life. She ended up dying of lung cancer when I was a senior in high school, and a friend's parents took me in until I finished the year. They were licensed as foster parents, so the state let me go." Shifting her crutches to embark on her daily walk, Lauren jerked her head for Jeff to follow. He did, and she didn't miss the way his hands hovered defensively as though she might fall any moment. "What about when you graduated?" "At that point, I was kind of on my own. I managed to get a scholarship to the vet tech program at the community college, and I worked the desk at a local clinic and doggy daycare. It was more fun than I ever imagined it would be, and it showed me how right the job was for me. Once I graduated, I worked there for a while, and I considered going back to school to finish my bachelor's degree and attend school to become a veterinarian. The doctors I worked for told me they'd help me with tuition as long as I promised to come back and work with them once I graduated." A slow smile spread across his face. "You must have really impressed them." "I guess, but it wasn't long after that I met Dean." The happy mood for moments before soured, and Lauren could sense Jeff tense beside her. "Once we got married and I got pregnant with Will, he didn't want me working anymore." She bit her lip, really not wanting to talk any more about Dean. "I'm really glad to be back at it." If he'd been surprised by her abrupt subject switch, he didn't comment. "I'm glad. Do you think you'll try and find a job at a clinic or stay at the shelter?" "Once I'm done here, I'll probably have to make more than I can at the shelter. I'd still be happy to do a few shifts a week with Bree, though. I enjoy working with her, and it means a lot to me to serve the animals who'd otherwise been forgotten." Forgotten, exactly how she'd felt as a freshly graduated 18-year-old with no family to speak of and dreams far bigger than her background would allow. They need someone. Jeff plopped down on his couch that night, finally making it to the leftover pizza he'd had in his fridge for 3 days. He'd been taking most of his meals at the shelter since Lauren's accident, but tonight Kayla had more or less pushed him out the door and told him they had it covered. Plus, the women had their Bible study that night, the one Lauren attended despite her major doubts, and he didn't want to provide any distractions. Flipping his remote over in his hand, Jeff waited for his TV screen to light up with news of the preseason football happenings. Finding what he wanted, Jeff settled back to enjoy the leftover supreme pizza with extra mushrooms he'd had delivered earlier in the week. Somehow, reheated pizza hit the spot just as well as fresh pizza, maybe even better. He'd almost finished his second piece, his mind drifting far beyond football to a certain curly-haired beauty who currently occupied most of his waking and sleeping thoughts. It was only the trilling of his phone on his end table that pulled him from it, a grin spreading across his face as he read the name lighting up the screen. Well, he said with a chuckle as he pressed the phone to his ear. "If it isn't my long-lost brother calling to check in on me. Are you on this continent, or are you still traipsing all over the world?" Hunter, his younger brother by 3 years, had spent his first decade practicing law working for a family law firm in New York City, handling some of the highest-profile divorces in the state. He'd been paid handsomely for it, but Hunter was nothing if not a bleeding heart. Not only had it just about destroyed him, he'd also spent every bit of his generous vacation package traveling all over the world offering pro bono consulting for nonprofit groups. He wanted to help make the world a better place, but the salary had been a tough one to walk away from. In the end, he'd left the New York practice behind and came to start his own family law firm in Bozeman. There were still divorces, of course, but they weren't fighting over Ferraris and beach homes in the Hamptons. They were trying to do what was best for their children, and when they weren't, he did his best to represent their interests himself. Jeff loved having his brother closer, but he couldn't lie and say it hadn't also been an answer to prayer to have him separated from his incredibly materialistic girlfriend, Victoria. Whether they were on or off was always anyone's guess, but she definitely wasn't who he'd have picked out for his little brother. "Yeah, I'm back," he said with a chuckle. "I had to wrap up a few things in Thailand, but they've finally managed to get the safe house funding secured. The organization can take it from here." Helping a global organization which worked to take down trafficking operations and establish safe houses and youth programs had been his brother's passion for years. He'd still work with them once he managed to find a partner for his practice in Bozeman, but traveling full-time had never appealed to him. "Good. I'm proud of you, Hunt. You calling to check in, or did you have any news with Gloria's case?" That was another thing he'd been helping with since getting licensed in Montana, helping the women at MVWS leave their abusive husbands with as many assets as they could. He'd also worked with prosecutors to get Dean Rafferty behind bars over a year ago. "Yeah, just wanted to let you know I'll be in town next week to do some interviews. I've got to talk to her, Kayla, and the kids if they're good with it. Basically, everyone involved." They haven't had any more run-ins with him while I was away, did they? "No. Everything has been pretty quiet around here except for Lauren's accident. Eli, that's Gloria's son, joined the basketball team at school, and her daughter, Sophia, has been going to an arts camp with the rest of the kids." Jeff took a sip of his water, thankful the summer had been mostly uneventful as far as work went. It was never a good thing to have excitement at a women's shelter. It usually meant new intakes, concern over an angry ex, or an older kid with enough anger to level the whole building breaking down. After Francis's husband, Stuart, broke onto the property that winter and Gloria's managing to run her and Kayla off a bridge in the spring, he'd be happy for a boring summer. Lauren's accident? Hunter's voice had lost all levity, moving now into the same one he used working particularly difficult cases. "What happened? Is she okay?" Hunter knew all about Lauren and her boys. He'd been to visit a time or two in the year and a half they'd been there, and he noticed immediately his brother had more than simple feelings of friendship towards her. "She was bitten by a dog at work," Jeff replied. The words still tasted bitter on his tongue. The idea of anything hurting Lauren ever again was a tough pill to swallow. "It wasn't too bad, but she'll be on crutches for a few more days." Hunter whistled, and Jeff heard rustling on the other end of the phone, as though his brother had finally settled in for the night as well. I bet the hero didn't respond to that too well, did he? He knew. Of course, he knew. Not only had Hunter been present for everything their mother had gone through, but he shared the same protective streak Jeff had when it came to vulnerable women and children. Wasn't my finest moment. Chapter 8. Lauren moved through the doors of Paws and Claws that Friday, free from her crutches and beyond thrilled to be back to work. Bree had managed for years without her help, but there was no doubt the place ran smoother with an extra set of hands. Waving at Jeff, as he'd insisted on dropping her off after the doctor's appointment, she let the glass door shut behind her as he fired up his truck and headed back to the shelter for the rest of the day. He and Will would also have another combat session that afternoon, as they'd added onto the showcase choreography in a way her son would probably need to practice. The sound of a loud bang from the cinderblock room where they did health checks and baths on the animal sounded, followed by Bree's firm voice. "Oh, no you don't, Missy. You smell like you rolled in your own poop, which is probably exactly what you did. It's bath time." Another crash, followed by a squeal from Bree, had Lauren hurrying to see what help she could provide. The sight wasn't what she was expecting, but it probably should have been. Bree had one of their doodle mixes in a loose headlock over the big metal sink they bathed the dogs in. The dog was wet, but Bree was soaked from head to toe. Her gray t-shirt and ripped jeans were about 3 shades darker than normal, and her hair dripped with soapy water. Bree's face grimaced in pain, but she masked it the second she saw she had company. As Lauren moved through the door, the doodles spotted her too and started barking, only to knock yet another metal container of dog soap and shampoo off the shelf beside the sink, the culprit of the crashing. Her entire body wagged when her tail did, but it was the mischievous doggy grin on her face that had Lauren nearly doubled over in laughter. "Need a hand?" "Oh, praise the Lord," Bree breathed as she squirted some soap onto the dog's back. "Gigi's in fine form today. Hand me the rinser nozzle, will you?" Bree stood stiffly and stretched out her shoulders. "I can see that." Lauren took the rinser nozzle off the wall and handed it to Bree only for Gigi to take the slight moment of distraction to jump for her freedom. She leapt happily out of the sink, landing on the floor with a sliding thud, and took off as though she didn't have soap all over her. In fact, with all the suds, her normally white curly coat looked about 3 times bigger than normal. Soap bubbles flew behind Gigi as she exited the room, leaving a slippery trail in her wake. "Gigi," Brianna groaned before lifting her eyes to the ceiling and breathing deeply. "That dog is going to make me insane. Why anyone buys and then abandons a doodle, I don't know." Lauren couldn't disagree. Doodles were routinely some of the worst-behaved dogs without proper training, in her opinion. Sometimes, even with proper training. They were expensive, so folks assumed they'd be calm and collected, but absolutely not. Gigi, in particular, chewed on anything she could get hold of and was far stronger than she looked. Speaking of which, Brianna had barely taken a step to chase the thing when the creak of a door and loud barking had her face paling. "Oh, no," Lauren said as loud screeches of terror sounded from the cat room. She broke the latch again. As the two of them sprinted, Bree sprinted, Lauren wasn't quite ready for that yet, towards the cat room. The memories of the last time Gigi had managed to get inside the cat room came flooding back. On pure instinct, Gigi loved to play with the cats. Although the cats regarded the intrusion as a hostile attack, Gigi barked, and by the time Lauren reached the cat room, Bree had already grabbed hold of the soapy, wet dog and did her best to corral her out of the room with all the felines. 2 of their larger males were covered in soap, both their eyes large as they continued to swat at the retreating pair. At least Gigi didn't seem to have any scratches this time, so that was something. Grabbing the leash off the wall, Lauren made a quick adjustable collar and slid it over Gigi's head. "Is this how you plan to welcome me back, girl?" Bree let out a long breath of relief. "Apparently. Listen, I need to change clothes and try to rinse some of the soap out of my hair. Can you handle things for a few minutes?" Her breath shuddered, and Lauren knew there was more to it than that with the way her boss moved. "Of course, I'll see if I can at least get this girl rinsed off outside. Why don't you take a rest? I'm sure you've been burning the candle at both ends since I've been gone." It was warm enough she could probably turn the hose on Gigi with no problem, and Bree looked exhausted. Her boss sighed, shoulders slumping in surrender. "Sounds good. I'm glad you're back, Lauren. How's the leg?" As Lauren followed Brianna down the hall towards the back of the building, they left a trail of water and soap bubbles in their wake. Maybe Lauren could get that mopped up after she rinsed Gigi, as Brianna looked exhausted. "It's good." Okay, that was a bit of an overstatement. It was a little sore, especially after demonstrating movement to Micah that morning, but it was far better than it had been initially. Her body had begun to heal, though she'd have a large scar for the rest of her life. "How's the dog? Did you name him?" Brianna shook her head, swallowing hard. "No, the hospital unfortunately had to report the dog to animal control. They showed up here not long after I got back." Lauren's memory was fuzzy from that day, but she thought Brianna had run him back to the shelter after taking her to the hospital. She'd come back so quickly, and Lauren had been on such strong medication, she couldn't quite remember. "Oh, Bree, I'm so sorry." The truth was the dog may or may not have ever been able to be adopted out. He'd been so terrified and aggressive. Through no fault of his own, if the marks on him had been any indication, it was inevitable. You did everything you could. I did, and I can have peace in that. Things don't always turn out like we hoped, do they? It was only then Lauren registered that Bree had come to the back of the shelter with her rather than out to her car to go home and change. Wait, don't you need to go home? She normally left her keys up front in her office, the room with a large glass window behind the front desk. I really can handle Gigi for long enough for you to take a shower. Oh, yeah, Bree said a little too quickly. I have a change of clothes here, so I won't have to go home. Her eyes shifted down and to the left, and her cheeks pinked. They reached the back storage room then, the one beside the back door, and Lauren noticed the door wide open. Normally, it stayed locked, and nothing Lauren had ever needed had been kept in there. Honestly, she had no idea what was in it. At least, she didn't until she spotted the sagging air mattress and quilt there on the floor, along with a rack of what looked to be Bree's clothing hanging at its foot. Bree, Lauren breathed softly as Gigi continued to wag her tail. Are you staying here? The room had water damage, smelled musty, and it'd be freezing there come winter. Do you need some help? A loaf of bread sat on the plastic crate Bree had fashioned into a nightstand, along with a jar of peanut butter and what appeared to be prescription pill bottles. Her boss's eyes widened. Oh, that? No, don't worry about it. She grabbed the handle and pulled the door shut at her back. My apartment's being fumigated for a bug problem, so I'm staying here for a few days. Her gaze shifted again. Come to think of it, Lauren didn't think she'd ever beaten Bree here in the entire time she'd worked here, and the woman always stayed later than she did. Still, if anyone knew what it was like to be pushed to talk when you weren't ready, it was Lauren. Nothing good would come of it, so she pasted on her best fake smile and made a mental note to keep an eye out for ways she could help her friend. Ugh, cockroaches. I have no problem with larger animals, but tiny beady ones who fly? No, thank you. Breathe, Will. You've got this, man. They'd been at it for more than an hour, but Will refused to give up. The choreography called for him and the other young man playing opposite him to grapple on the floor. They were straightforward moves. Of course, no one would actually get hurt, but the poor kid hadn't managed to let Jeff pin him yet without tapping out and having to do his breathing exercises. As Jeff held a loose hold around the kid's neck, as the choreography called for in the combat scene, he suddenly wished he could call up Felicity or Sam and ask them to change it. Surely, some other move could be done to pack the same punch. Will's breaths moved from deep and controlled to shallow and fast, and Jeff could feel his whole body tensing rather than preparing for the next piece of choreography. Without waiting for Will to tap out, Jeff let go. It's okay, kid. Hey, why don't I call Mr. Lawson and dash? No. Will scrambled to his feet and shook his head wildly. The scene is from West Side Story. It's apparently an iconic piece of stage combat. All the older guys went on and on about it when Mr. Lawson and Mrs. Gunn told us about it. I have to get this. Honestly, Jeff knew no one would begrudge him a small tweak, but Will needed to get control over his fears regardless. It was tough. He'd been through things no kid his age should ever have to walk through, but he was stronger than his pain. All right. Then, I'm going to teach you something my stepfather told me before I went off to join the service. Something that's come in handy more times than I could count. What's that? Will's eyes were wide, but at least the redness in his face had begun to recede. He taught me about grounding. That's not what they called it back then, but it's something I use alongside my fighting words. It helps place me in the current moment without letting my mind spiral. See, my biological father wasn't a kind man. In fact, he was a lot like your father, I'd guess. Thankfully, his mother had gotten them out of there when he was a little kid and Hunter was a toddler, but that kind of stuff stuck with a man. My stepfather came along later, but he's a good man who I consider my real father. I never knew about that, Will breathed. You come from soiled stock too? Jeff let out a chuckle. Where in the world did you hear that phrase? Sometimes Will sounded like a normal kid, and other times he'd swear there was an 80-year-old man in there waiting to come out. Dunno. Guess I read it somewhere, but it fits. Maybe, but it doesn't have to define you. It certainly doesn't define me, and the reason why has to do with what my stepfather taught me. He said every man needs fighting words, not words to pull you into a fight or to start one, but to finish the one that's raging right here. Pointing to his temple, Jeff stared the boy down. If you can't fight the lies the enemy tells you, you're going to be in a world of hurt. In addition to that, he taught me how to pay attention to my five senses. What can I see? What can I hear? Feel? Smell? Taste? It helps your body break the momentum of fear and slows your mind enough to think clearly. The enemy wants you flailing, man, but God doesn't give us a spirit of fear. We'll toad the dirt at their feet, studying it intently. By the enemy, you mean the devil? Sure do. He's going to try and use your father's actions to hold you back for the rest of your life. You can't let him, mostly because you have a far greater power on your side if you accept it. Will sat down, his long legs and long arms disproportionate to his torso in a way that meant he'd probably have a growth spurt soon. I think I get the grounding. Miss Kayla taught us this 5-4-3-2-1 technique in therapy. What are your fighting words? I don't think I asked you last time we talked about it. Well, mine are different from yours because every person is different. The ones I repeat the most are, the Lord defines me, I can trust him, and his power is perfect in my weakness. That last one's from the Bible, isn't it? Jeff grinned. The Bible studies the shelter did every week had started to sink in. Yep. Strength isn't in never reacting when you're scared. That would make you a robot. Jeff took a seat in front of Will with a wink. It's pushing through when you don't think you can, but also knowing it's time to take a break and fight another day. Maybe, when you don't feel strong enough to fight the fear, a fighting word might be, he'll make you strong. You get to decide at that point which direction you want to go. Will plucked a stick from the ground, drawing in the dirt in the quiet for a moment. I guess I'd have to be following Jesus for that, right? Well, the Bible says he gives us the Holy Spirit as a helper when someone has made the decision to follow him, but I also believe he's really gracious to the ones who are still seeking. I've been praying about it, Will grumbled. Like you told me to do. I guess I don't know if I'm doing it right. Jeff leaned forward, placing his hand on Will's shoulder. You can't do it wrong, bud. He wants to hear from you. Now, is your strength today to take a break until tomorrow, or are we going to keep pushing? With a deep breath, Will pushed to his feet. We're gonna keep pushing. At least, until Mrs. Rhonda calls us in for dinner because I'm hungry. Chapter 9. Later that evening, Lauren sat on the back porch of the shelter watching all three of her boys play 2-on-2 basketball with Eli. Sophia, Ella, and Gracie worked on choreography for their arts camp on a grassy area, and the women rocked in the rocking chairs while gushing over Frances's baby, Haley. She's so adorable, Gloria said as she made silly faces at the tiny cherub. Haley's skin was alabaster white, her eyes bright blue, and her wispy little hair blonde for the moment. Whether her eyes and hair would darken, they'd find out, but she'd be perfect no matter how she grew. Those eyes are so big and beautiful. Frances beamed, leaning over the arm of the chair as she studied her baby. I feel like I spend hours a day staring at her and thanking God for how he brought such beauty from such an awful story. The tiniest pinch in Lauren's heart made itself known, as did a tightening of her belly every time someone brought up things of faith. She stayed quiet, never one to begrudge someone their faith, but she wouldn't participate. I know, Keely said. She'd been finishing up her nursing practical shifts over the last few weeks and barely had a moment to breathe, so Lauren had only seen her friend in passing. I look at those girls out there and wonder how in the world they could have so much joy after the start they had. How could a loving God allow that start? Why wouldn't he have gotten them out sooner, or kept Keely from marrying her abusive ex-husband in the first place? Why hadn't he done the same for them all? The thought fluttered through her mind that she wouldn't have her boys if she'd never met Dean. Their lives were worth all the pain, but it still felt cruel to force it on them. Gloria smiled at baby Haley once again. Eli told me the other day he wants to go on the youth group campout this month with the rest of the kids from church. Her eyes misted, and she swallowed thickly. I feared he'd never want anything to do with God after what his father did, but he's more curious than ever. I know I have Chris to thank for a lot of that. Speaking of your husband, how is everything going with your case against him? It was the first time Lauren had spoken, effectively changing the subject from things of faith. Gloria sighed, handing the baby back to Frances as she settled back in her chair. Jefferson's brother, Hunter, has been so helpful. He's actually coming into town later this month to get some of our statements on everything that's happened. Again, it's like the Lord has provided who we needed right when we needed it. Does he think they'll manage to keep your ex behind bars? That was always the question. Sometimes, like in Dean's case, it was so open and shut there was no question on how to proceed. For others, the system failed the victims and had them looking over their shoulders for years. Like, for good, or at least until her kids were 18. If Lauren had been a praying woman, that would have been her prayer. She'd be fine dealing with anything Dean could fling her way so long as all the boys had grown into men and couldn't be infected by his poison. By then, they'd be long through the shelter program, and hopefully, she'd have established a good life for them in Reindeer Pass. Will, the one who'd suffered the most due to his age, would hopefully be long grown and gone with a family of his own before Dean even came up for parole. As for Brady and Ben, they'd hopefully at least both be over 18. Sweet, sensitive Ben, with his penchant for bringing home hurt and scared animals, would be the easiest target for Dean to try and worm his way into. The idea of her tender-hearted little boy letting the monster back into his life kept her up at night. That's the hope, Gloria said. I'm praying the Lord moves and works. It's all I can do. I want to control it all, but I can't. I have to surrender. Lauren didn't speak as the women continued their conversation about Gloria's upcoming court date. What would it be like to have such peace in the face of uncertainty? Did Gloria have the constant churning of bile in her gut at the possibilities of things to come? Did she wake up in the middle of the night with the nightmares appearing so real she thought she'd never be free of them? Did her children's futures feel like crushing unknowns or hopeful what-ifs? Will had told her about that day's session with Jeff, extolling the virtues of fighting words rooted in faith. What would it be like to blindly trust things would work out according to some cosmic purpose? For years, she'd felt a little like the tiny rubber ducky her boys had all played with in the bath when they were younger, except in her mind it floated in the middle of a choppy sea. It stayed afloat, but only barely as the waves thrashed. The image of the tiny rubber thing felt so small amongst the vastness of the ocean. Jeff's fighting words and the effect they'd had on Will weren't things she could want. If she asked Jeff about them, it would no doubt give him false hope she might one day come to the same faith he held. It wasn't fair, but there was nothing she could do about it. Too much had happened, too much life had been lived. As the sun slowly set over the mountains in the distance and the birdsongs, dribbling basketball, little girl giggles, and the music playing from Ella's phone wafted through the shelter's backyard, Lauren wondered where it all might lead. Was there a world in which she could come to the same faith where the rest of them had found such inner peace? Wait a second, Jeff said as he held up a hand to Kayla's boyfriend, Chris Poplar. Did you just say you're going to be bronc riding in a rodeo? Why in the world would you do that? Chris was the high school's assistant principal, but he was also a cowboy. He managed the equine therapy program the women and children at the shelter participated in, therapy Lauren and her sons were currently participating in. It was Saturday, the only day that week Lauren didn't have to work and the boys weren't at camp, so this was the day the shelter had chosen to schedule the equine therapy. Normally, Rhonda and Kayla would drive the 15-passenger van out to the ranch, but Jeff had volunteered today due to both of them being buried in preparations for a meeting with their board of directors the next week. Chris chuckled, handing off Ben's lead rope to Eli Santos. Eli, Gloria's son, was the oldest kid at the shelter, and he'd been working for Chris since earlier in the spring. It had kept him out of trouble, but the kid had also blossomed under Chris's mentorship. It's a high school rodeo. I told the school's team if they made it to state, I'd do it at the annual school rodeo we do as a fundraiser every summer. All the proceeds go to the upkeep of the team's animals, so I figure it's a good cause. Wait, there's a high school rodeo? Growing up in New Jersey for most of his life, Jeff didn't think he'd ever heard of such a thing. Yep, it's pretty big in Montana, but they have it all over the country. No bulls or anything, but they put a flank strap on the bronco to make it buck. It doesn't hurt the animal. It just makes him mad. Like a rock in your shoe or something. Well, didn't that beat all? Does Kayla know you're doing this? He grinned, the cowboy's affection for Jeff's boss clear. Yep. She told me I have to wear a helmet and chest padding, which we make the high schoolers do anyway. It's not nearly as dangerous as the adult circuit, though I won't say it's without risk. Jeff thought more about it as he watched Lauren, Ben, Brady, and will finish up their therapy session. All three boys had come so far since they started, but it was Lauren who left him mesmerized. She had a natural affinity for animals, obviously, but that extended to horses as well. She'd always said she'd never been interested in large animal veterinary care, but watching her with Poppy, it was hard to understand why. Something had been off with Lauren for the last day or two. She hadn't been snappy or angry, just clearly lost in thought. Now, as they wrapped up their session, Jeff couldn't help but push off the corral's gate and cross the sandy enclosure to see if she needed any help. The boys had theirs under control, as Eli usually helped Ben and Brady with their saddles. Will didn't need it and wouldn't appreciate the interference anyway. Her curly blonde hair wild under the helmet as it stuck out of its braids, Lauren had already dismounted. Pressing her face to Poppy's, she closed her eyes and breathed deeply. Poppy seemed to enjoy it, as well as the gentle hand she ran from her forelock to the tip of her nose. Not wanting to interrupt the peaceful moment, Jeff watched Lauren for a second until she opened her eyes. Oh, Jeff, sorry. I didn't know you'd come up. Did you need something? I was going to ask you the same question, he said with a smirk. Chris said Poppy needs a bath, so I figured I'd help out. Not to mention, he'd like to get to the bottom of whatever was bothering her. By the way, did you hear Chris is going to be in some sort of rodeo next weekend? Chapter 10. Lauren ran a soapy hand down Poppy's side, grateful she didn't have to avoid getting her stitches wet anymore. The wound still smarted with some swelling and tenderness. Micah's deft hand with the sutures and a healthy round of antibiotics to ward off infection had both gone quite far in allowing her to heal. Jeff did the same on the other side, as the mare chuffed happily. I think someone's enjoying her spa day. Before Lauren could respond, Brady and Ben came running into the barn and skidded to a stop in front of her. Mom, Ben said with wide eyes. Eli asked if we wanted to see the baby born a couple of weeks ago. Can we? Sure, is he in the barn? Eli shook his head. No, he's in the west pasture. We can take the side-by-side and be back in a minute. It has seat belts, he hurried to add. The kid who'd once been surly and angry had completely come out of his shell working with Chris. He'd also gained so much confidence playing basketball again. I'll have them back in 20 minutes, Ms. Rafferty. Unable to hold back a slight grin at the boy's respectful address, Lauren caved. Sure, but boys, wear your seat belts the whole time. Pinning them both with a mom stare, Lauren waited until they both nodded feverishly. Where's your brother? He's coming too, Ben said quickly. He was talking to Mr. Poplar. The side-by-side was a 4-seater, so there should be plenty of seat belts to go around. All right, but don't dawdle. We've got to get back home. With that, her boys sprinted off towards the ATV with Eli following at a far more relaxed pace. Eli has come alive since he's been working here. I know, Jeff said as he started to lightly hose down Poppy's side. He's been coming to church with Gloria too, and he's really found some good friends in the youth group. He's signed up for the campout this weekend. The youth group does a campout? Lauren could only imagine how anxious she'd feel if asked to go. Actually, now that she thought about it, Gloria had mentioned it the other day, but Lauren had been distracted. Having the boys away from her for even a night felt bigger than she was ready for yet. For the middle school also? Jeff shrugged. Yeah. I go to help chaperone every year, as does Chris. Some moms and dads go too. Will hasn't mentioned it? All 3 of her sons frequently went to church with the rest of them, but Lauren hadn't been able to make herself do it. It wasn't about Pastor Chris or any of the folks she knew who attended. There was this block there. No, she said softly. Do you think he wants to go? The idea her own anxiety would keep her kid from doing something he really wanted to do ate at her, but could she let him even if he did decide to go? Jeff continued to hose Poppy down with the fine mist of the hose, the mare bobbing her head appreciatively as he did. If he did want to go, he said hesitantly. You could come. Staring at the man over the horse's back, Lauren narrowed her eyes. I doubt they'd want a chaperone who didn't even believe the stuff they are teaching. Actually, Chris's voice sounded from another part of the barn. We'd love to have you. We need one more female chaperone, and Cam's been scrambling to find one since Harper had to drop out. She wasn't supposed to be scheduled to work. They had 2 nurses go on maternity leave, so they need all hands on deck. I think I can trust you not to voice your doubts in front of the students, but we welcome doubters and skeptics. His voice had gotten louder as he'd spoken, closer until he stopped outside of the stall where they bathed Poppy. God's not afraid of your doubts, Lauren. He's not afraid of your questions either. Could that really be true? Lauren didn't respond past a simple nod as Jeff and Chris started talking about logistics for the campout. Adults would sleep in hammocks surrounding the perimeter of the site while the kids would sleep 2 or 3 to a tent in the middle. By the time Chris left, something kept nagging at Lauren as she grabbed the towel off the hook and started to dry Poppy. Why do you think Will hasn't mentioned it? Maybe he doesn't even want to go, Jeff answered. You'll never know until you ask him. If he does, would you let him? Would she? Not unless she went with him, that much was certain. It would mean leaving the other boys at the shelter, which felt much more palatable than sending one off in the woods without her. Rhonda would stay overnight with them if she asked. She'd offered the same to all the women there. I don't know. I guess, maybe if I went with him. So much of her children's childhoods had been stolen from them. She didn't think she had it in her to take one more minute of it. Jeff moved from his side of Poppy to hers, pulling her into a hug as though he sensed her inner turmoil. You're a really good mom, you know that? It was a quick hug, but Lauren found herself wishing she could bottle up the safe feeling of being in his arms and pull it back out on the days she felt like she was drowning. So much of her life for the last 18 months had felt like treading water, unable to take a deep breath except for the times she knew her boys were all safe inside the walls of the shelter and Jeff was at her side. She was the rubber ducky again, fighting to simply stay afloat. Thank you. That means more than you know. Jeff lifted his hand and cupped her cheek, running his thumb down her skin as he studied her. I'll tell you as often as you need, honey. With that, the roar of the side-by-side's engine sounded. Seems like the hooligans are back, he chuckled. Let's get everyone loaded up and head back. You can talk to Will later this afternoon and decide what you want to do. A few hours later, back at the shelter, that's exactly what she planned to do as she sought out her oldest son as he sat under the big oak tree in the backyard and read a comic book. Hey, bud, got a second? It had been the first time she'd had a chance to talk with him one-on-one since the barn that morning, and as much as she dreaded the conversation, it was one she'd have for the sake of her son. Will looked up with a raised brow. Sure. What's up? He closed his comic book and sat up a little straighter. The sight of it, his attempts to be the man of their family despite his still boyish shoulders, he couldn't hold that weight. It would crush him. Is something wrong? No, not really. Jeff told me about the youth group camp out next weekend. I know you've been busy with arts camp. Did you not want to go? Will shrugged. It doesn't matter. I know you'd never sleep if I went. I'm not gonna do that to you. Sweet boy. He knew exactly how much his mother worried about him. It was less scary to leave the younger boys at the shelter behind the familiar, safe walls, but out in the woods without her? No, he was right. It would have been too much. Lauren wrapped her arm around Will's slowly broadening shoulders. As young as he was, he should have never been forced to carry so much. It was the burden his father had placed on them all. With a kiss to the top of his curly blonde hair, so like her own, Lauren sighed. What if I went with you? He didn't deserve to live in fear of how she'd react to things. He deserved to live fully and completely. His childhood had been stolen from him, but his adolescence didn't have to be. Still, as his brown eyes widened, Lauren saw the tiny child who used to squeal and reach for her whenever she'd come in the room to get him out of his crib. You'd do that? I mean, it's a church thing. There's gonna be some sort of sermon or something. Pastor Cam's going. I know, but you're right. I don't think I'd feel comfortable with you going without me. Jeff's going, so I absolutely should, but I'm not there yet. I'll come with you. Brady and Ben can stay here with Rhonda, Keely, and probably even Kayla when she finds out I'm doing this. You deserve this, buddy. He really did. He'd been working so hard with Jeff to build his combat confidence and practicing his lines for the arts camp showcase. He'd even sat kindly and listened when Brady wanted to show off his drum skills which had a long way to go to resemble actual music. I don't even know what to say. Thanks, Mom. Anything for you, bud, but you have to promise me one thing. His brow furrowed, the tension in his shoulders easing back in. What's that? If we go fishing or something, you've got to bait all my hooks and touch all the fish. By the time Jeff got home that evening, his entire body ached with fatigue. It wasn't so much the physical exertion from the day, but rather the bone-deep exhaustion from knowing the woman he'd grown to care so deeply for didn't have a relationship with Jesus. At the same time, could he dare hope Lauren seemed to be softening to things of God? Not long ago, she wouldn't have even considered going on the campout, but before he left the shelter, Will had come running up to him and asked him if there was still time to sign up. Earlier, in the barn at Chris's ranch, he knew there was so much more going on inside that head of hers she hadn't yet shared. The barn. He'd almost kissed her while they washed Poppy. It would have been a bad idea, and his gratitude at being interrupted felt both providential and foreign. There was no way he'd be able to think through it all tonight. He certainly didn't feel like cooking, so heating up some leftover steak and scrambling some eggs were probably in his future. At least, they were until he pulled his truck into the driveway of his modest cabin and spotted a familiar SUV, the one he'd teased Hunter mercilessly about when he got it. The shiny black color and chrome finishings were luxurious, as was the leather interior. Jeff couldn't complain about the heated seats in the wintertime in Montana, but they were still far fancier than anything he could have ever pictured his down-to-earth brother driving. He'd paid cash for the SUV, used actually from a wealthy lawyer in his previous firm, the one who'd convinced him he needed to look the part as a successful attorney. At this point, Hunter could probably sell it and buy something far more practical now he had his own practice, but it really wasn't any of Jeff's business. There, lounging in one of the chairs on his front porch, Hunter flipped through what looked to be case files in his casual look of jeans and a t-shirt from his Ivy League law school. Well, he said as he placed the files in the chair as he stood. Look who's finally home. Thought I might have to ground you for missing curfew. It wasn't even that late, but Jeff chuckled anyway. Try it and see what happens. Moving quickly up the steps, Jeff pulled his brother into a quick hug. I thought you weren't coming until next week. Change of plans. Hunter didn't elaborate, so Jeff didn't push. Is it okay if I crash here for a few extra days? Of course. Come on in. I was about to have some steak and eggs unless Mr. Chrome Finish is too highbrow for that. Jeff gestured towards the car, and Hunter rolled his eyes. Only if you don't oversalt them like you normally do. Now it was Jeff's turn to roll his eyes. How's Victoria? She's still in London. Last Jeff heard, Hunter's on-again, off-again girlfriend had gone to London to work with an entertainment law firm there. It was a US-based company, but they'd opened offices all over the world and paid prominent attorneys to relocate. They'd met during Hunter's time in New York, but Jeff had never particularly cared for the woman. Wouldn't know, Hunter replied coolly. Again, he didn't elaborate, so Jeff didn't press. Still, he didn't miss the pain flashing in his brother's eyes at the mention of her. Well, I'm glad you're here. I'll be helping chaperone a campout this weekend, but you're welcome to stay here as long as you don't throw any wild parties and trash the place. Hunter's chuckle felt a little forced, but he slowly perked up. Deal. Chapter 11. Dude, Jake Collins said as he took in the sight of Wilson's blazing marshmallow. You didn't roast a marshmallow, you made a torch. The boys had crowded around the fire at the campout, all trying to see who could make the superior s'more. Predictably, it had devolved into daring each other to see how long they could leave it in the fire before it was no longer edible. They'd met their match with Will, though. For as long as Lauren could remember, her eldest had loved the crispiest marshmallow possible. If it wasn't crunchy, it was far enough gone. Settling back in the lawn chair she'd borrowed from Rhonda, Lauren sighed happily as she watched her son with his friends. This was what she'd always wanted for him, for all her boys. Cam, Jeff, and Chris were the male chaperones, as well as a couple of the youth group fathers. There weren't as many mothers along, but there weren't as many girls on the trip either due to a girls' soccer camp which overlapped. Apparently, a good chunk of their girls played, so it was a boy-heavy campout. That never bothered Lauren though, as she frequently called their room at the shelter the frat house due to the constant burps, smells, and noise which came with being a mom to 3 boys. The sun had started to set by the time Jeff pulled his camp chair up beside her on one side, Pastor Cam on the other. "Well, Lauren," Cam said as he ran a hand over his blonde hair and let out a tired but happy sigh. "What do you think of your first campout?" "I'm really glad you got to come. I know the kids really enjoyed you sharing stories from your job over dinner." He chuckled. "I still can't believe you guys have a bearded dragon." "2 of them," Lauren replied. Lucy and Ethel aren't nearly as much trouble as the furrier animals. They'd hiked in that afternoon and would be doing a second one the next morning. It wasn't far, and Lauren was pleased with how her leg had held up. "I bet." Cam sat and chatted for a few more minutes before a couple of the boys started trying to see how many marshmallows they could stuff in their mouths at once. I think I'd better go make sure neither of them puke in an effort to win this particular competition. I'll be back." Both Jeff and Lauren laughed as they watched the pastor hurry away, and Lauren took a sip of her water. "He's not what I thought a pastor would be like." They hadn't done any sermons yet, but she knew one was coming before they went to bed. It was a church campout, after all. What did surprise her was the fact she was actually looking forward to it. Jeff cleared his throat before responding. "What did you expect?" "I don't know. I guess more stuffy or maybe constantly trying to work every single thing back to faith. It would have been fine if he was, I don't know. It's different than you expected." "That makes sense. Yeah, Cam's a cool guy. I have a lot of respect for how he's dealt with things at church, especially how he donated so much of his father's money after he died." Honestly, that had never made any sense to Lauren. Why in the world would you keep working full-time when you could live off an inheritance? Sure, if she suddenly came into money, she'd still work some at Paws and Claws because she loved her job. Full-time? No, definitely not. Yeah, I guess he didn't want it after all those years of a strained relationship. "I don't think that was it," Jeff said thoughtfully. "I think he felt like the Lord had provided for him through his calling of being a pastor. He had no need for all that money, and he wanted to honor the Lord with it by giving to the MVWS. It sure was a blessing. We were able to hire 2 more security guards and bring on Kayla full-time as a result. Not only has she been invaluable to the work there, but she and Chris would probably still be mortal enemies if they hadn't been somewhat forced to become allies. Sometimes, things the Lord calls believers to do don't make much sense from the outside, but we don't look at things with the same perspective he does." It was probably the longest conversation she'd ever had about faith with Jeff, but oddly, she didn't feel itchy like she needed to run away or she was going to burst out of her skin. What perspective is that? A heavenly one, I guess. I don't pretend to have all the answers, and I'm definitely no pastor, but I can't help but look at so many situations I thought were hopeless in my life and see God's hand working things for good. I mean, look at Chris and how he ended up doing equine therapy. Look at Kayla and her trauma she experienced. Harper and her awful family, even Cam and the death of his brother. None of those things were easy, but God used them to lead people to the lives He'd planned for them. I know you're not sure about all this, and I don't ever want you to think I'm trying to diminish what you've been through. He paused, running a hand down his face before turning to look straight into her eyes. I want you to know He hasn't forgotten you. I may not know as much about Scripture as Cam, but I know that. They sat in a comfortable silence for a few more minutes before Jeff had to get up and help a couple of the boys set up their tents before they turned the poles into swords. Later that evening, as they settled in under the blanket of stars around the still blazing campfire, Cam took out his Bible and began to read. "But we have this treasure in jars of clay to show this all-surpassing power is from God and not from us. We are hard-pressed on every side, but not crushed, perplexed, but not in despair, persecuted, but not abandoned, struck down, but not destroyed." Could that really be true? Cam looked up and addressed the students. Guys, 2 Corinthians tells us in chapter 4 exactly how to press on in times of hardship. Maybe you didn't get into the college you wanted or a relationship ended. Maybe your parents are having problems with each other or money. Maybe it's something entirely different, something I don't know about. I can tell you this, it matters to God. The way he spoke to the students, as though their problems were more than silly teenager worries, endeared her to the pastor more than she could have thought. So often, kids and teens had their worries brushed off. They learned to believe their problems were no one else's because they didn't feel as dire as adult ones. She'd been treated that way, and it was that very mindset which sent her into the arms of a man who'd one day become her nightmare. Cam continued as the campfire flicked and sparked under the stars and tall pines. The chapter continues on. We always carry around in our body the death of Jesus, so that the life of Jesus may also be revealed in our body. For we who are alive are always being given over to death for Jesus' sake, so that his life may also be revealed in our mortal body. So then, death is at work in us, but life is at work in you. Cam looked up once again, smiling softly at the group. That feels confusing, I'm sure, but let me see if I can clear it up. When he says, we who are alive, he means those who have accepted Christ. We always want to view our sufferings, even though the pain can be very real, in light of eternity. With God, we have hope because we know this is also temporary. Over the next few minutes, Cam continued to speak about how the hardships we face on earth can either drive a wedge between us and the Lord, or they can bring us closer. Lauren had never thought about it in the way he spoke, but somehow it made more sense than it ever had. Lightning bugs flashed in the distance, and the students hung on every word Cam said. Jeff, who'd returned to his camp chair next to hers just before Cam started speaking, reached over to take the hand she hadn't even realized she'd been clenching. It wasn't obvious, not to any of the students, but it gave her calm in a way she couldn't explain. Cam looked back down to his Bible, reading by his phone's light. Therefore we do not lose heart. Though outwardly we are wasting away, yet inwardly we are being renewed day by day. For our light and momentary troubles are achieving for us an eternal glory that far outweighs them all. So we fix our eyes not on what is seen, but on what is unseen, since what is seen is temporary, but what is unseen is eternal. I get it, guys. When my brother passed away and my father blamed me for it in his grief, the whole world felt darker. It was only Christ who gave me peace, and it was only him who helped me fix my eyes on the unseen treasures of heaven. We are only here for a moment in the span of eternity. How we live, who we choose to follow, what we choose to believe, that's what ultimately matters. Are you hopeless, or will you accept the hope of Christ with peace the Bible says passes all understanding? I know what I choose, but I can't make that choice for you. It was only then Lauren realized tears had spilled from her eyes and down onto her cheeks. Could it all really matter to God? Could her relationship with Dean, her marriage to a monster, be something that drove her to a source of hope rather than let her continue to simmer in the bitterness she'd lived in for so long? I want to pray to close us out, Cam said as his eyes flicked to her before going back to the kids. Could he see her inner turmoil? Did God tip him off? I want everyone here to know God hears you too. He wants you to know the peace only he brings. He loves you, and none of the pain is wasted when we surrender it to him and allow him to shape us through the healing. With that, he bowed his head and led them in a closing prayer. Lauren closed her eyes, doing her best to get a handle on the tears continuing to flow in rivulets down her cheek. Jeff squeezed her hand, reminding her he was there, but not doing anything else as she continued her quiet moment of release. By the time Cam finished the prayer, Lauren had mostly gotten a handle on herself. The kids all stood and started moving towards their tents, Will included, as he thankfully hadn't noticed her distress during the sermon. Jeff continued to sit with her, and the two of them watched as the fire died down without speaking for a while. How long they sat there, her drawing comfort from his presence, she didn't know. It felt a little bit healing all on its own. Finally, she broke the silence. I feel like I've been run over by a truck. Jeff chuckled softly, squeezing her hand once more. Sometimes it can feel like that when we come to a crossroads in our life. Do you have any questions about anything Cam said tonight? I can probably answer some of them, but I think talking to Rhonda or Kayla about them would be a good idea too. I won't push. In the glow of the firelight, Jeff turned to face her. There was an ocean of thoughts behind his expressive brown eyes, but all he did was stare into hers. "Jeff, can I ask you a question?" "Anything, honey." His voice was low, gruff, but in no way aggressive. "You've told me what brought you guys out here from Atlantic City, about your father, and why your mother left him." It was probably one of the reasons she'd been so drawn to him in the first place. She'd seen the good man standing before her, the calm and steady beacon of hope that Dean hadn't irreparably harmed her boys despite all they'd seen and experienced. How, despite all that, can you believe all you said to Will about the truth of his fighting words and God's plan for him? There was no animosity in her heart when she asked it, not like there'd once been. Jeff sighed deeply, not letting go of her hand, but letting his gaze drift up to where the smoke and ash danced on the breeze as it rose. "I didn't for a while, but one of the chaplains in the army saw past my anger and bluster for the hurt it really was. I can't answer all the questions you have, honey, but I can tell you this. God didn't make Dean hit you, and he knows exactly what I'd like to do to that man if he ever happened to be in arm's length. He's given me the ability to make peace with all the hard places I've been." Jeff continued, his hands still soft on hers despite the passion in his eyes. "He was with me in the deserts during my deployments, with me when I came home and needed help acclimating back to civilian life. He led me to Chris's equine therapy program, and Chris is the one who introduced me to Rhonda when he heard she needed a new head of security. I didn't know that. The pieces started coming together, but there was still so much she didn't know. Wait, aren't you scared of horses?" He'd always seemed a little hesitant around them. He chuckled, shaking his head. "I'll never be mistaken for a cowboy, but I can ride when I need to. I'd never get on a bucking bronco, but Poppy doesn't scare me. All that to say, God brought me through the fire, and he led me to peace I needed badly. He can do the same for anyone who wants it. Like I said, I won't push you, Lauren. I'm always here if you have more questions. I'm an open book." At the moment, all she wanted to do was lay down in her hammock and stare up at the sky. Would she pray? Cam said he would listen if she did. "Not right now, but I'm sure I will." With that, she stood and made her way to the hammock she'd hung earlier, the one she'd borrowed from Micah's wife, Sarah, as they did a good bit of overnight backpacking. It was comfortable, though Jeff had needed to show her how to hang it. As she went to settle into the fabric, her eyes went back to where Jeff stood by the fire. His hands were in his pockets with his head bowed. He was praying, she had no doubt. For the first time, that knowledge didn't make her uncomfortable. It didn't send her skin crawling and her stomach roiling. In fact, the knowledge someone prayed for her felt a little like a warm blanket and steaming cup of coffee on a chilly January morning. It wrapped around her like a thick blanket, promising her she wasn't as alone as she'd felt for so long. Chapter 12. "So," Brianna said as they led another calf into the observation pen at the rodeo the next week. "How was the camp out?" "I feel like we've barely seen each other this week thanks to me going out for errands every time you're on duty." It was true. They'd been busier than Lauren could remember being since she started at the shelter. Spring meant babies, but summer often meant just as many of them, coupled with older dogs or those animals folks had gotten for Christmas and decided they were too much. As the sun started to set behind the mountains in the distance, Lauren looked out over the rodeo grounds. It was unexpected. She'd been mulling over her conversation with Jeff, as well as the faith questions she'd started asking ever since. Brianna ran a hand down the calf's side. They'd been enlisted to help Dr. Young with vet checks for all the animals at tonight's benefit rodeo. All the proceeds would go to the high school rodeo team, and she'd agreed to help out as a way to get volunteer hours for the PDA. Plus, Brady was absolutely obsessed with joining the rodeo team once he got to high school, and she figured she ought to learn what she could before the time came. "What does that mean?" Her friend's question wasn't curt, just curious. She stretched her back one way, then another, grimacing in what appeared to be muscle stiffness. "I guess I haven't let myself ask questions about God and faith since I came to the shelter. Early in my marriage to Dean, I thought maybe if we went to church, he might see the error of his ways. It didn't work, and he never let me get close to anyone there anyway." Brianna smiled sadly, stretching her neck this time. Did you blame the church for that? Honestly, probably. It was a last-ditch effort, and I needed to connect to someone. I was a young mom with a little boy and one on the way. I was terrified of what was to come, knowing Dean had only gotten worse since Will was born. I guess I felt like if God was real and as powerful as everyone said he was, he must be as evil as Dean to allow it. Nodding, Brianna directed the calf to where Dr. Young had motioned for it. The calves would be roped as part of the competition, then let loose again. For a healthy calf, there was no real risk of the animal hurting themselves. Dr. Young would carefully inspect all four legs, hooves, and the general constitution of each calf so hitting the ground as their hooves were tied wouldn't exacerbate any existing issues. Now? What changed at the campout? I guess I can't really put it into words yet, Mom. Before Lauren could say anything else, Brady came flying towards her and skidded to a stop outside the pen. Mr. Poplar said I could ride one of the horses in the kickoff lap around the arena if you say it's okay. Can I? He bobbed up and down, looking more like the 5 or 6-year-old boy he'd once been rather than the boy on the cusp of middle school. Is it one of his horses? Chris knew his horses well, and he'd trained them to the point she trusted them with her most precious possessions. Yes, it's Poppy. He said I could hold the Montana state flag if I felt comfortable riding and doing that at the same time. In the same way Eli had grown to love the horses out at Chris's ranch, Brady had fallen in love as well. What had started as a job to keep Eli out of trouble had become an incredibly valuable mentor relationship between him and Chris Poplar. As Brady made his way through equine therapy, he'd asked to do more and more of it. After their summer arts camp, he'd go out any day he possibly could, never tiring of the work if it meant he got to be around them. There was no way she could say no. Okay, but be careful, please. Listen to Mr. Poplar and do exactly as he tells you. Brady hooped and climbed on the bottom rung of the fence to place a quick kiss on her cheek before running off in the direction of what she assumed was Mr. Poplar and the rest of the horses. Ben was with Brady, probably burning through the dinner money she'd given them with cotton candy and sodas. You're a really good mom. You know that? Brianna handed off the next calf to Dr. Young while Lauren moved to get the last one. They're great kids. Thank you. I don't think any mom can hear that enough. It was true. Especially in the days of social media and the constant barrage of information, as it often felt like she was drowning in the suggestions of what she could be doing. Never mind, as a single mom, she didn't have the capacity for most of it. It's really something to watch them come into their interests as they grow. By the way, speaking of mothering, are you okay? You seemed like maybe you've got some muscle soreness going on. She was also wearing long sleeves, not overly abnormal for even summer nights in Montana, but different from her normal short-sleeved t-shirts. Her hands moved slower too, as though stiff while she gripped the calf's lead rope. I'm fine. Just slept weird last night. Lauren didn't believe her for a second, but she truly didn't want to push too hard. Okay, well, let me know if you need something. Okay. I know you're living, I'm good, Lauren. Bree said quickly. Tell me more about what the boys have been up to at arts camp. Has Brady been getting into riding? Fine, a brush off it was. Brady has really enjoyed the arts camp, especially his percussion rotation, but I wouldn't be surprised if he asks to work with Chris and Eli out at the ranch next summer. Will, on the other hand, has fallen completely in love with theater. Ben's kind of along for the ride at this point, but he's enjoyed sketching and painting. Like his mama, he also loved animals, and he had such a heart for the ones who were hurting. All of them were great boys despite the influence of their father, and she knew she had men like Chris Poplar and Jeff to thank for it. Speaking of interests, Brianna said knowingly as she tilted her head behind Lauren. Your man arrived. Her eyes widened before furrowing her brows. Who's that guy with him? Casting a glance over her shoulder, Lauren tried to calm the butterflies who'd started dancing in her stomach. Oh, that's his brother, Hunter. He's staying with him for a while. The brothers approached, the two of them worlds different in everything but build. Jeff had light brown hair with a beard which swung between close-cropped stubble to weeks of growth. Hunter had a darker complexion, was clean-shaven the one time Lauren had met him earlier that week, and an inch or two shorter than his older brother. Hey, ladies, Jeff said as he crossed his arms over the corral fence. Checkups going well? His clothes were nothing fancy, jeans and a t-shirt, but he wore them well. It may have taken her over a year to admit it to herself, but the man was probably the most handsome one she'd ever seen. It was physical, sure, but she'd not been able to separate the looks from the golden personality since the day she left Dean and laid eyes on the man who had become one of her best friends. She'd first seen him through the gates of the shelter, and even now over a very different type of gate, his very presence calmed her. It did the same for her boys. They are. So far, we haven't had anyone who needed to sit out. We're almost done here. Brianna, this is Jeff's brother Hunter. Hunter, this is Brianna. Brianna runs the animal shelter, Jeff finished. Was that a flush on her friend's face? Pleased to make your acquaintance, Brianna said as she did an awkward attempt at a curtsy there in her jeans and muck boots as she held onto the calf's lead rope. Immediately, her face flushed further, and Lauren could all but feel her embarrassment. Nice to meet you, ma'am, Hunter said with a chuckle as he bowed a little from the hips. Jeff mentioned coming by the shelter one day this week to help out, so I'm sure we'll see you again. Brianna shifted her weight, still not looking up, only to step right into a cow patty. Oh! Her little squeak broke the tension as she jerked her muck boot from the mess, but Lauren and Jeff had joined Hunter in his amusement by then. Getting control of herself, Lauren decided to take mercy on her friend. Jeff, would you check on the boys? We'll took Ben off somewhere, and I haven't laid eyes on them in a while. Brady is with Chris by the horses. He's riding in the opening laps. Sure thing, honey, Jeff said as he clapped a hand on Hunter's shoulder. Let's go find the hooligans, and I'll buy you a funnel cake. Hunter snorted, elbowing his brother. Okay, honey. Don't think you can get your grubby paws on it. Do you know how long it's been since I had a funnel cake? The brothers continued to bicker good-naturedly as they moved towards the rest of the fairgrounds, but it was only once they were out of earshot Brianna groaned. I think I blacked out. Please tell me I didn't just curtsy and step in a cow patty as I met that man. With that, Lauren burst into the laughter she'd done her best to hold back for Brianna's benefit. You made quite the first impression. This has been way more fun than I expected it to be, Hunter said as they stood from their spot in the bleachers. Jeff took the last bite of his hot dog, tossing the paper in the trash as they passed it. I didn't know what to expect, but I'll definitely be interested to see Chris ride that bronc. Apparently, he's pretty good at it. Behind them, Rebecca Anderson, a young woman who attended their church and taught agricultural education at the high school, scoffed. He's better than pretty good. Rebecca was a pretty woman with dark brown hair and olive skin from all the time she spent outside at her farm outside of town. It was something of a homestead, if Jeff understood correctly, raising most of her own food and supplying a fair number in the community with eggs and produce when she had excess. She wasn't Lauren, and the one date Jeff had tried to go on with her told him exactly how successful he'd be trying to date anyone who wasn't the blonde beauty currently doing a last-minute check on the sheep. Oh, really? Yep, Rebecca replied. You may not know. My daddy taught agriculture at the high school before I did, and he was the rodeo coach as well. He tried for 2 years to get Chris on the team after some of the older boys had seen his ability to ride at his family's ranch one summer. But his first love was always basketball, and rodeo definitely isn't a sport without injuries. He never would join, but it wasn't for lack of trying. The three of them moved towards the concessions area during the break between events, and Jeff hoped they'd make it before the lines got too long again. He'd laid eyes on all 3 of Lauren's boys in the past 20 minutes, so he felt pretty confident they hadn't wandered off. Interesting. I'm surprised your team got him on a bronco tonight, at least with a flank strap. Hunter's brow raised. Flank strap? Rebecca nodded. It's how they make them buck and run. It doesn't hurt them, but it's not all that comfortable, so they try to pop it off. The team will come up as soon as Chris either gets bucked off or dismounts himself, and they'll get the strap off. It's amazing how docile most of them get as soon as they're free. The 2 of them talked for another minute, but Jeff's attention was pulled away by the sound of Lauren's laugh. She stood with Ben, the latter holding a large ice cream cone he lapped up furiously as though it would float away. Abandoning Rebecca and Hunter to discuss the finer points of the sport of rodeo, Jeff made a beeline for the woman who'd occupied so many of his thoughts for the last 18 months. All done with work for now? Unless one of them has an issue, yes. Lauren's shoulders drooped, but her eyes sparkled with the excitement of the evening. I'm going to need the heating pad for my back tonight. I'm not 22 anymore. She chuckled, and Jeff couldn't help but send a prayer of thanks to the Lord she was more squarely in his age bracket. Ever since they'd had the conversation about faith at the campout, his hope she'd one day come to know the Lord had expanded tenfold. She'd never seemed so soft to the possibility before, and Kayla even told him she'd sought her out to ask more questions earlier that week. It was impossible to keep the hope at bay, the prayer that the one thing keeping them apart would disappear if she gave her life to the Lord, but it was more than that. Regardless of whether or not they ever dated, or if they dated and it didn't work out, it was far more important to him she found the same hope he had. After all she'd been through, resting in the peace of what the Lord offered her mattered more than any relationship ever could. Brady did so well in the opening laps. He'd grinned from ear to ear as he held the American flag in one hand and the reins in the other. It was good to see him enjoying it. Lauren smiled, the sight a bit of a gut punch to Jeff even after all this time. He really did. Seeing them do what they love, it's more special than I ever realized it would be. Just then, the announcer came over the loudspeaker. Ladies and gentlemen, as our final event, we've got a special treat for you. Chris Poplar, our esteemed assistant principal, has agreed to saddle up and try his hand on a bucking bronco. The crowd went wild, the students' love for Chris and his work clear. As the music started, Jeff felt Lauren bury her head against his arm. I can't watch. With a chuckle, Jeff wrapped that arm around her and pulled her to his chest so she wouldn't have to see what would more than likely be a very tame 8 seconds. I'll let you know when it's over, honey. Hunter moved up to the gate and raised a brow at Jeff and Lauren's position, or maybe to the hand Jeff held in her hair as he held her close, but he didn't speak. Would it break his heart if she came to know the Lord and chose not to pursue a relationship with him? Sure, but it would be worth it if it meant she had the assurance of salvation. The horn blared, and the chute opened with Chris atop a bronco bucking harder than any of the kids had ridden. Wherever Kayla was, Jeff had no doubt she had her face buried in her hands. It didn't appear she had much to worry about, however, as Chris moved his body along with the ebbs and flows of the bucks like he was part of the animal rather than simply a rider. His body stayed loose, one hand in the air, as the clock struck higher. The next second, the horn blared once more, and the crowd went wild. He'd done it. He'd stayed on for 8 seconds. Now, the only question was how in the world he'd get off. They didn't have to wonder long, as Chris did some sort of fancy swing of one leg over the still bucking bronco and pushed himself back from the horse's body in a bit of a jump and run. As soon as he hit the ground, Chris regained his footing and sprinted away from the animal while the team moved in to remove the flank strap. He's done, Mama, Ben said excitedly from beside them. His mouth had ice cream all over it. The sight so cute Jeff couldn't even be annoyed the boy's words caused Lauren to pull back. That was awesome. I'm sure it was, buddy, Lauren replied as she made no move to pull away from under Jeff's arm despite having shifted to face the arena again. Glancing up, Lauren's eyes met his, her lips close enough to kiss if he was so inclined. He was, but it wasn't time. There was no chance he'd sacrifice a future for momentary pleasure. Still, as she smiled softly, Jeff knew there was little he wouldn't do to make it happen again. Chapter 13. Come on, Bruno, Lauren coaxed at the increasingly gentle giant. Let's try a walk today, okay? The poor, beautiful beast stepped forward on shaking paws, all 140 pounds of him breaking Lauren's heart. Bruno was a mastiff who'd been abused by his owners until a neighbor realized what was going on and called the police. He'd come to the shelter earlier in the spring, growling and ready to fight anyone who even got close to him. How in the world Bree had gotten him into the cage in the first place was a miracle, but over the months she'd been here, Lauren had seen past the bluster for what it was. The gate was open, and Brianna had given them space to work in peace. Lauren didn't go inside his cage, merely keeping the door open and letting him come to her. That's right, boy. You know I'd never hurt you." Even the other dogs would be kept out of the yard until they'd finished their walk, at least for the first few times they went. Bruno stepped forward once, then again, eyeing the harness in her hands. "This is on your timetable, buddy. I won't force you." There was more than once Lauren would have sworn he understood her, and this was one of those times. As he stepped forward again, those long, muscular legs shaking, it reminded her of how she'd probably looked to the world around her recently. It had been 2 weeks since the campout, and 2 weeks since she'd prayed for the first time she could remember. 2 weeks since she and Jeff had sat by the fire talking about things she'd refused to even think about before. Since then, it was like he looked at her differently. Was there hope in those beautiful eyes of his? Maybe, but he didn't push. He'd left the door open for her to talk about things of faith, and they'd had another conversation or two. Mostly she'd talked with Kayla and Rhonda, even Harper on occasion. As Lauren reached in her pocket and took out another treat, Bruno took 3 more slow steps in her direction. His eyes, brown and beautiful in their own way, held hope as well. He'd reached her, taking the treat from her hand the way they'd done the last few times she'd tried to coax him out of the cage. This time, she held a harness in her hand, one fit for a beast. Holding up the harness, Lauren held it out for Bruno to sniff. She wouldn't rush him, that would end about as well as if Jeff had pushed her to make some sort of decision that night by the fire. "What do you think, buddy? Are you ready to give it a try?" Bruno didn't step back, his floppy ears remained forward. His tail didn't wag, but it wasn't tucked between his legs despite their shaking. "Well, here goes nothing." Hoping she wasn't about to have a second bite to heal from, Lauren gingerly placed the harness over Bruno's head and torso. He didn't growl, didn't even cower too badly as she guided his legs through the opening. He flinched a little when she clipped it in place, but some gentle pats to the head and a pet down his coarse fur had his muscles relaxing once more. Lastly, the leash. She held it up for him to sniff, hoping with everything in her it wouldn't set them back. Clicking it into place as well, Lauren breathed a sigh of relief as Bruno didn't even flinch. They moved slowly towards the door, and Lauren spotted Brianna's hiding spot peeking out from her office. Her eyes were wide and filled with tears at the sight, and Lauren winked at her as she and Bruno passed by. "Give us 5 minutes, then come outside and see what he does." Her boss nodded, and Lauren continued through the door to the fenced backyard where all the dogs loved to play on nice days. Would Bruno one day be among them? Oh, she hoped so. The sun beat down on their face, warming her through, and Bruno paused to lift his face towards the sun as well. Reaching down, Lauren unclipped the leash while leaving the harness attached. "Okay, buddy, you can go play." Initially hesitant, Bruno quickly began to romp and run around the half-acre yard with dog toys galore. He sniffed, rolled, and generally acted like a puppy again. She only realized tears were rolling down her own cheeks when Bree came to settle on the bench beside her and handed her a tissue. "That's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen. I can't believe he's so mobile after all the time in the cage." Mastiffs tend to get stiff after too much time of inactivity. That in and of itself was a bit of a miracle. "Seems like someone's been looking out for him," Brianna replied. "There was a time I thought he'd never let anyone close again. I guess there was also a time I thought I'd never see you at a Sunday church service either." Lauren's cheeks pinked. Bree didn't speak with judgment, only careful curiosity. "Honestly, I thought the same, but I guess things change." Since the rodeo, Lauren had been to the last 2 Sunday morning services with her boys. She'd not yet come to Sunday school, but the idea had become more palatable with each passing day. "I'm not sure how much scripture you and the ladies at the shelter have gone over, but do you mind if I share what my prayer has been for you ever since I met you?" "I don't have to if you're not ready." Lauren thought for a moment, honestly searching for the true answer. "I think I'll be fine. Tell me." "Well, I've obviously been praying for healing for you in every way you'd been wounded, but there's a passage in the book of Ezekiel which talks about God giving a new heart and spirit. He replaces the heart of stone and gives a heart of flesh. The heart of stone is hurt and closed to the truth of God, hard because its defenses have been formed and forged in the fires of life. A heart of flesh is open, vulnerable to hurt, but also to the peace the Lord wants to give. I've been praying for the Lord to give you a heart of flesh and the peace only He can give. It might have been offensive to some, and the Bible certainly had an interesting way of wording things, but the metaphor struck with Brianna's kindness. Thank you for sharing that with me. I don't know where I stand, but I'm definitely moving in a direction I never expected. Brianna reached over and placed her hand atop Lauren's, and the two of them watched Bruno sniff and mark every tree and bush he possibly could. Take all the time you need, Lauren. We're all here to cheer you on. Kim always says we need Jesus and we need each other. I have a tendency to hermit, and I'll be the first to admit I don't allow others to share my burdens the way I need to. Like the fact you're living in your office? Lauren's brow raised, and her friend nodded guiltily. Yeah, like that. I'm fine, really, but I'll let you know if I do need help. Lauren didn't respond after that, content to sit and watch the dog, who'd so wholly stolen her heart, roll around in the dirt and grass again. So, Hunter said as he placed another plate on the bar of Jeff's garage gym that afternoon. You gonna tell me what all that was about with Lauren the other night, or keep pretending you weren't making eyes at each other like no one else was at the rodeo? Jeff placed another plate on the other side, then slid the clip in place to keep it from sliding off. I'm surprised you managed to go this long without asking. It had been 5 days since the rodeo, maybe a record for Hunter's reign on his nosiness. Maybe I've grown up a little, or maybe I've been so busy with Gloria's case I haven't had a chance to eat lunch. Bothering you is my favorite pastime, but it's not the primary reason I'm in town. Hunter wiped his face with a towel as he moved to spot Jeff's bench press. But nice try. What's going on there? Jeff didn't speak while he lifted the bar off the rack and pressed out his reps. Once he'd re-racked the weights, he sat up and grabbed his water bottle from the floor. She's searching, man. I can tell the Lord's working in her, and I'm not going to mess that up by sticking my nose in prematurely. He'd been playing the long game for months, and Lauren's faith had always been more important than any feelings he had for her. That's fair, but you're not worried some other guy will come along and shoot his shot before you get a chance? Jeff's gut tightened at that, but he couldn't let the fear of what if drive him. If he does, he does. Lauren's so busy with the boys and work, I'm not sure where she'd even meet anyone else. The thought gave him comfort, as did the way she'd burrowed into his chest rather than watch Chris potentially get thrown from a Bronco the weekend before. That's all you're getting. Tell me about Gloria's case. She's permitted me to share with all the shelter staff, but you know I normally wouldn't be able to tell you a thing. Hunter sighed and moved over to the chair Jeff kept next to the squat rack. Lifting his own water bottle, he took a swig before speaking. I think the case is pretty open and shut, but we'll know more after the initial hearing next week. Mr. Santos had not only injured his wife and children through his abuse, he'd also run Kayla and Gloria off the road and into Colson River earlier in the spring. Were it not for Kayla's quick thinking and her insistence in keeping auto multi-tools in every vehicle she entered, the outcome could have been disastrous for Gloria, Sophia, and Kayla. Police had been able to track the truck to one he'd borrowed from a cousin, providing enough evidence to hold him without bail for a while thanks to his other crimes. Still, Gloria would feel much better once he was behind bars alongside Dean Rafferty, and Jeff would too. You staying in town until the hearing? Hunter nodded. Wanted to talk to you about that, actually. I'm considering opening a satellite office out here. I'm getting more and more work out of the surrounding counties due to a lack of other family lawyers, and I think my team in the city can handle the cases we have there. You'd move out here rather than send one of your minions? Jeff chuckled at his own joke, but pride in how quickly his brother's business had grown. I have a partner there, Hunter said as he tossed his sweat rag at Jeff's face. I like it out here. Bozeman isn't exactly New York, but it's even slower out here. So, I guess that means you're really done with Victoria once and for all. If Jeff could shoot fireworks right there in his garage, he would. His brother sobered. Yeah, we're done. She's dating some family friend, an heir to this big pharmaceutical company. Seems more her speed anyway. Jeff had never made a secret of how he felt about Victoria, but he'd done his best to respect his brother's relationship. Now, enough talk. Come over here and spot me before I tell everyone in town about how you still cry whenever anyone talks about where the red fern grows. Chapter 14. Lauren and Bree pulled into the shelter's heavy gates a few days later, prepared to catch a cat who'd apparently wandered into the yard. They'd run it through their program of vaccinations and spaying or neutering depending on its gender. Rhonda hadn't been able to get close enough to tell, but hopefully the treats they had in their pockets would entice the poor little thing out from under the porch. "Oh, my goodness," Bree said as she pulled to a stop in the front drive. "What in the world?" Lauren looked up from her phone to see whatever had Bree surprised and burst into laughter. Not only did Jeff stand there covered head to toe in mud, but Hunter did too. Jeff wore his typical cargo pants and shelter-emblazoned polo shirt while his brother filled out his dress shirt and khakis with the same muscle. The older brother looked no worse for the wear, save for the mud, but Hunter's shirt was ripped, a shoe was missing, and his pants didn't look like they'd ever be the same. Stomach aching from the laughter she'd not experienced in a while, Lauren stepped out onto the concrete and placed a hand on her hip. "Why do I feel like I'm going to be really sad that I missed whatever happened here?" "Because," Rhonda said through her own wheezing laughter. "You're a smart woman." Tweedledee here figured he'd try to chase the cat up the tree and fell into a mud puddle below. Tweedledee was apparently Hunter, as that's where her thumb pointed. All the rain they'd had the last few days meant the whole property was littered with mud puddles. The boys loved them, and any spare minute they weren't at arts camp, they were jumping in them to splash. And this one, Rhonda continued, wasn't any better. Once his brother fell out of the tree and the cat got away, Tweedledum figured he'd chase the thing on foot like he could possibly catch a scared cat. "I almost had it," Jeff muttered. "I tripped on a root, and she went under the porch." He looked so dejected Lauren almost felt bad for him. Well, she would've if the whole situation wasn't so funny. "Hang on, I need to take a picture for the boys when they get out of arts camp today." Holding up her phone, Lauren plastered on her biggest smile. "Say cheese." It didn't take long for Lauren and Bree to manage to coax the cat from under the porch with treats and catnip. She, which was confirmed during a quick belly scratch, did not particularly like the kennel. Still, she let them coax her inside with the promise of wet cat food in the back of the cage. It had been late enough in the day that Bree had gone ahead and taken the animal back to Paws and Claws while Lauren stayed at the shelter since she'd carpooled into town that morning anyway. Jeff and Hunter had both gone into the bunkhouse attached to the guard shack to shower and change, and both returned now wearing the shelter's security uniform of gray cargo pants and black polo shirts. There they are, Tweedledee and Tweedledum. Lauren grinned widely from her perch on the porch, waiting until it was time for Keely to bring all the kids home from arts camp. "Har har har," Hunter said as he climbed the steps. "I thought I looked pretty cool. Kind of a G.I. Joe situation." "Nah, more like a kid playing dress-up," Jeff teased as he followed his brother up the stairs. "Bree get the cat back to the shelter safely?" "Yep. She's all settled in for the night. We'll take her to the vet tomorrow and get her fixed up. Then, she'll either become an intake for us or I can convince Rhonda the shelter needs a pet cat once she heals up from her surgery." Jeff took a seat in the rocking chair next to her, while Hunter took the porch swing. "If you can convince her to do that, you're a bigger miracle worker than even I thought." Before she could respond, Lauren's phone rang in her pocket. Keely's name flashed across the screen, and Lauren swiped to answer. "Hey, did they convince you to stop for ice cream on the way home?" Wherever Keely was, it was loud. No. Listen, Lauren, you need to get down to the arts campsite now. Is Jeff with you? Or Rhonda?" It wasn't the first time in her life Lauren had felt time stop. When Dean came home in a drunken rage, she'd felt the same thing. The only thought remaining in her head was how to protect her boys. She had to get them to safety. "What's happened?" The second Jeff heard Lauren's voice change from gentle teasing to quiet panic, his head whipped around to face her. Her face had drained of blood, her eyes filling with tears as she listened to whatever Keely said on the other end. She'd frozen, but something she heard had her snapping out of it a second later. "I'll be right there." "Yeah, Jeff's here." "Are they already looking?" Jeff had already stood and pulled his keys from his pocket. "I'll drive." "Where to?" Hunter had jumped to his feet as well, always ready to help whenever anyone needed it. Whatever was wrong, Jeff knew it wasn't minor. Lauren looked like she couldn't decide whether to fight, fly, or burst into tears, and the helplessness shattered Jeff's heart. Lauren hung up, her hands shaking as she slid the phone back into her pocket. To camp. Brady and Ben, they're missing. She sniffed loud, and Jeff held back a groan as he took her hand. That camp was surrounded by woods on 3 sides. Wildlife was the least of their worries at this time of year, as they only had 4 or 5 hours until the sun set and shot the thousands of acres of the national forest into pitch black. My babies are missing. Not for long, Jeff vowed as he led her down the steps and towards the guard shack where he'd parked his truck. We'll find them, honey. We'll find them. How in the world he could promise that, he had no idea, but there was no other option. Anything else would shatter her, and Lauren did not deserve more heartbreak after everything she'd carried. Knowing all too well how bad things happen to good people all the time, Jeff put the pedal to the metal of the truck as they covered the 10 miles to Art's camp in half the time it normally took. The whole way, he strung together a litany of prayers. Lord, keep them safe. Lord, help us find them quickly. Lord, don't let this drive Lauren away from you as she's starting to surrender. Lord, keep them safe. There was no eloquence, no smart words filled with fancy theology he'd learned from Cam over the years. No, it was a cry of a man who'd come to love those boys like they were his own. He'd spent more time with Will during summer doing combat training, but Brady and Ben were his boys too. They'd spend hours on the front porch playing cards or in the living room with video game controllers while Jeff taught them the finer points of his favorite childhood games. As Brady had moved from trading cards and cartoons into horses, rodeo dreams, and drums the way kids tended to flit from one obsession to the other, Jeff had been the one to buy him his first boots. Ben, the soft-hearted little guy whose fearless streak ran as strong as his sense of humor, charmed absolutely anyone into doing whatever he wanted with a show of those dimples and sparkling blue eyes. As they turned into the camp's location, a retreat center in town often used by churches, school groups, and all kinds of other organizations for team building and getaways, his hand reached over to find Lauren's. It was a long dirt road, and the whole way down it, Jeff's prayers moved from inside his mind to something he hoped would give Lauren some peace despite the absolute terror running through her. Lord, he began as they dodged a pothole and the center came into sight. Be with us. Go before, go beside, go behind. Lead us to these boys and be glorified in the process. Give Lauren peace that surpasses all understanding. In your name, amen. Hunter murmured and amen behind them, but Lauren didn't speak as Jeff pushed his gears to a grinding stop in the bevy of cars who'd already arrived. Jace's police SUV was already there, as were 4 other police cars. Robert Gunn, Felicity Gunn's husband and the head of fish and wildlife for the town, had shown up as well along with 2 other vehicles stamped with their logo. Someone had apparently called Rhonda as her sedan came flying up the drive behind them, sending dirt and gravel into the air. The Paws and Claws truck had arrived as well, as had Cam's truck and Harper's SUV Jeff recognized from her time volunteering at the shelter. There were other cars there as well, ones Jeff was less familiar with, and 2 more came flying down the dirt road as they pulled in. Felicity, the drama teacher at the high school and the head of the camp, spotted Lauren in his passenger seat and sprinted their direction from the spot she'd been standing with Jace, Keely, and a few others. Will sat on a bench under the pavilion, his head in his hands until he seemed to sense his mother's arrival. The boy's head popped up, and every bit of the 12-year-old kid who'd started to look so grown-up lately stood and passed Felicity to barrel into his mother's arms as tears streamed down his face. She'd barely hopped out of the car when her eldest son reached her and found his safe place once more. He was nearly as tall as she was, but this was a boy who needed his mother. As Jeff rounded the truck to stand next to Will and Lauren, Felicity reached them. Lauren, I'm so sorry. We already have a team of police and fish and wildlife out looking. They were here 1 minute waiting for Keely to come pick them up, then they were gone. We have no idea what happened. I'm so sorry. Felicity had her own daughter, a 5-year-old named Annie, so she knew exactly what it felt like to feel as though your heart and soul walked around outside your body. Jeff had never experienced it until Lauren's boys had started to feel like his own, but he felt it now in an intensity which threatened to choke him. "Get us up to speed," Jeff ground out as Jace approached and more cars continued to file into the retreat center. What do we know? Chapter 15. Within the next hour, Lauren's entire life had turned on its head. Most of the whole town had converged at the site where they'd been having the arts camp, with Jace Todd communicating to his entire team of officers via satellite radio. "Sending the K-9 unit out now," Jace said as he nodded towards one of the officers Lauren didn't think she'd met yet. "They'll take the east first, then fan around in all directions." Chris's truck pulled down the long gravel drive with a horse trailer attached. Kayla in the passenger seat and Eli in the back, along with Rebecca Anderson, who taught agriculture at the high school. She was also the rodeo team coach and had always been kind to Lauren when they'd crossed paths. With his window rolled down, Chris waited for Jace to notice him. "We brought some horses to help get into places which are tough for the ATVs. Rebecca, Eli, and I already have radios, and we can start in whatever direction you need us to." Jace glanced skyward, and Lauren's heart sunk at the realization they only had a few hours of daylight left. Brady and Ben might well be out there after dark, and her entire stomach rolled at the thought. As Jace stepped away to give Chris more instructions, whatever she'd had for lunch at work that day made its way back up. Her boys, her babies, they were out there alone. As though her entire body rejected the very real possibility, she heaved onto the grass at her feet until the familiar scent of sandalwood and oak she'd come to associate with Jeff accompanied the feel of a soft stroke to her back. "Easy there, honey," he whispered. "We're going to find them. Robert's already got a crew looking from fish and wildlife, and there are nearly 100 people here to help. I'm going out too." "I'm coming with you," she said as she unceremoniously wiped her mouth on her sleeve and took the water Rhonda handed her. "I can't stay here and worry. I have to do something." Jeff didn't even try to argue. "All right, Mama Bear, you can come with me. We're going to find them." "I know we will." Tears pricked her eyes as anger and desperation over the situation sprung forth. "How could you possibly know that?" "Because God has not left them. He goes with them, and I have faith he will lead us to wherever they are. It won't be the first time he's moved mountains, and it surely won't be the last." With that, Lauren took a long drink of her water as Jace approached again with more guidance for the volunteers. The water felt like knives going down, but she'd be no help to anyone if she got herself dehydrated on top of everything else. Jeff placed a hand on her back. "I'm gonna get a good location from Jace and we'll set off. No one would fault you if you wanted to stay here with Will. You don't have to go." Her eldest son had perched himself back on the log he'd been on when they arrived. This time, Felicity sat beside him with her arm wrapped around his shoulder in comfort. "He's all right. Felicity and the others will look out for him." "I have to go, Jeff. I can't stay here and worry all night." The way the sun rapidly set, there was a good chance they'd be out there well past dark. Jeff nodded, understanding clear in his eyes. "All right. Let me ask Rhonda to help Felicity watch out for Will, and we'll get going." They'd been scouring the wooded trails for nearly 2 hours when the visibility had lowered to the point Lauren had to turn on her flashlight. It was dark, and Brady and Ben were out in the woods all by themselves. Chris, Rebecca, and Eli had all gone out on horseback, while Fish and Wildlife had taken their ATVs in the other direction to cover more ground. Police scoured the woods as well, but city workers weren't the only ones who'd showed up. As Jeff and Lauren had set off in the direction Jace circled on the map, Matt and Becca from the bakery showed up. They'd dropped their daughter off with Micah and Felicity's parents, and they'd come alongside Hannah Todd. She was married to Jace and worked at the bakery with Becca. From what Lauren briefly registered while Jace explained their area to Jeff, they'd closed the bakery early and brought everything left in their cases to feed those assisting in the search. Cam was there, as were a great number of church members, and she recognized more than a few school families as well. Once they found the boys, all the help Reindeer Pass had given them would touch her heart. It had become home despite the bumpy road she'd taken to get there. As the minutes ticked by, the confidence they'd find them before disaster struck waned. What if they'd run into some sort of animal? What if Dean had somehow gotten out of prison and had come to get them? Her breath started coming faster and faster, body shaking as she failed to stop the spiral of her racing thoughts. Her heart raced, and sweat poured down her face despite the cool night air. The tips of her fingers went numb, and suddenly the world around her started to tilt. "Whoa," Jeff's calm voice sounded through a tunnel. "Easy there, honey. Let's sit down for a second." Her breaths came faster and faster, nearly in time with her racing heart. What if he's got them? Sobs shook her to her very core, the idea Dean would come anywhere near the children he'd sired. What if Dean escaped? When she'd ended up seated on the rock, she had no idea, but all of a sudden Jeff knelt in front of her and took her face in his hands. "Oh, honey, I thought you heard me ask Jace about Dean. I'd have told you if I thought you'd missed it." That was one of the first things Jace checked. Dean is still safely behind bars in the state prison. There's no way he had anything to do with this. The world slowly righted itself, but sweat and tears still wet her cheeks. What if there was a bear? Or a cougar? They didn't have any food on them. "I know they're hungry." Jeff pulled her into his chest, rubbing her back as he let her sob for a few beats of his steady heart. "We have to trust God is with them, honey. I know you're new to all this, but we have to surrender our boys to the Lord. We'll have to do it over and over again for the rest of our lives." His words registered, and her brow furrowed. "Our boys. I didn't mean to say that, but it's how I feel." Jeff paused. "I've grown to love those boys alongside loving you, but that means I have to surrender all of your safety to the Lord. He goes before," he repeated once again. "He goes beside. He goes behind. He knows exactly where they are, and he loves them more than anyone else on earth could hope to, even their mama bear." Could it possibly be that easy? I don't know if I can. You can't. I can promise you can't do it on your own, but he can help you. Surrender yourself to him, and he can help you surrender everything else. He readjusted his hands to stroke her tears away with his thumbs. "I know this is awful timing, but you need peace that surpasses all understanding right now. You need the hope only he can bring." Something in her, the same thing pulling her that night by the fire, called to her once again. Her boys, her babies, they needed a higher power than she possessed. In the moment, she was about to fall apart if she didn't offload the burden she carried. Yeah, I'm ready to surrender. What do I say?" His hands dropped from her face to wrap themselves around hers in a tight grip. "Whatever you want, honey. Speak from the heart, that's all he's asking for." Jeff held back a groan as he adjusted the flashlight he'd carried. It was nearly midnight, and though the whole town had basically come out to search, Brady and Ben were so far nowhere in sight. "Come on, Lord. Help us find them." Plodding along beside him, steps both exhausted and determined, was Lauren. They'd traipsed around these woods for hours, as had everyone else, and so far no one had seen neither hide nor hair of the boys. How far could they possibly have gotten? Just then, Jeff's phone dinged in his pocket. An unknown number had texted. "Unknown number. Hey Jeff, it's Sarah Kane. One spot we haven't looked yet just occurred to me. To the northwest of the retreat center property, there are some old sapphire mines closed to tourists due to some cave-ins about 10 years ago. I'll send you the coordinates for them, but if the boys went out there and got stuck, that could explain why we can't find them." His blood ran cold at the idea of the two of them stuck in a caved-in sapphire mine, but she had a point. They'd long since been boarded up, the sapphire trade not what it used to be, but it was possible. "Jeff, we're not too far from there. Thanks for the heads up. I'll wait for your coordinates." She had them to him before he could take another breath, and he turned to tell Lauren only to find her reading the text over his shoulder. "Sapphire mines?" Her voice trembled, but even in the low lighting from their flashlight, he could see the hope in her eyes. "Yep, let's go." The two of them walked as quickly as they could without rolling an ankle and slowing them further. Getting closer to the coordinates Sarah had sent them, it made sense why no one would have thought to look in that direction. There was a drop-off, one about 10 to 15 feet deep, with a boarded-up mine entrance just ahead of it. There was no way the boys could have gotten into the mine, but what if they'd gone into the surrounding dig sites and gotten stuck? The extra dig sites ranged from 5 feet deep to twice that in some areas. Sarah Kane was a runner, but not just any runner. She ran trails like they were her sole piece in a world of turmoil. The thousands of miles she'd run in these woods would stagger anyone's mind, and no one knew them as well as she did, save for maybe Robert Gunn, the man who also happened to be her brother-in-law since they'd both married Kane's siblings. Then, Lauren called as she approached the drop-off and immediately started to shimmy down. "Brady!" "Lauren, wait." Jeff's heart beat wildly at the idea of her losing her grip on the perilous roots and rocks she held onto. "We need to do this safely." "Toss down a rope, Jeff. I'm going to look for my boys. There's no way I'll be able to pull you out if they're hurt and need help quickly, but you can. Stay up there, and I'll see if I can find them." Everything in his being rebelled at the idea of sending Lauren down there without him. 8-inch okay, I'm tossing a rope down and calling for backup. As soon as they get here, I'll come down and join you. There was no arguing with her in this state. Right now, Lauren was a mama bear protecting her cubs, or at least doing everything she could to do so. "Be careful. We're trusting God, remember?" She hopped the last 4 feet off the slope, looking around at the 2 or 3 acres which had once been a dig site and camp for the mine. "At least, I'm trying. You can't stop, or I don't know if I'll be able to." With that, the woman he'd fallen in love with over the past 18 months moved slowly but surely over and around the mounded dirt and even deeper holes. How deep any of them went was anyone's guess, but she was right. They'd said they'd trust the Lord with the boys' rescue, and that's exactly what they'd have to do. As Jeff sent off for backup, he immediately began a prayer vigil he had no intention of stopping until the boys were back in their arms. The Lord went before, he'd go beside, and he'd go behind. They had to trust him. There was no other choice. Chapter 16. Lauren squinted as she stubbed her toe on something hard and metal. The clang echoed in the darkness, but it was hard to see anything in this pit, even with her flashlight. The metal was rusted, the hood of a car, maybe? Why in the world would that be down here? "Lauren," Jeff's worried voice called through the night. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine. Just stepped on something." He didn't respond, so she kept moving further and further into what had once been sapphire mines transformed into a tourist trap. Folks would come dig in the deeper pits, trying to find the gemstone in the rich dirt of the area. It was a summer activity, one she'd done as a child on a field trip at least once. Still, many of the mines started experiencing cave-ins as they became overdug and unstable. Those running the places for profit had no understanding of the engineering needed to stabilize the area, and what started as a fun day out for families and school groups became tragic a time or two. Virtually all such mines closed down, as making them safe would render them unprofitable. "Lord," Lauren prayed with a trembling voice, the activity still completely foreign. "Help me find my boys. Lead us to them tonight, and I promise I'll be at church every time the doors are open." That probably wasn't how you did it, but Lauren didn't care. For her babies? She'd trade her own life for theirs. A chill went down her spine at the idea of them alone in the world, but the alternative of her here without one or more of them. Unthinkable. Then, as clearly as though she heard it on the breeze, the scripture Cam had taught at the campout came back to her. "We are hard-pressed on every side, but not crushed, perplexed, but not in despair, persecuted, but not abandoned, struck down, but not destroyed." It was from 2 Corinthians, and it had struck her so deeply she'd memorized it with Kayla while they met and studied scripture. She sure felt pressed at the moment, as though a dragon of what if breathed down her neck, but for the first time in her entire life, there was something else there too. Kayla had also taught her about the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego from chapter 3 of the book of Daniel. They talked about how believers never had to walk around feeling as though no one else walked in the fire with them, as the Lord sent the gift of the Holy Spirit. Honestly, the difference between the Old and New Testaments was still a mystery to Lauren, but there in the darkness of a pitch-black night, she felt another presence beside her. With a deep breath, she continued slowly maneuvering around the old dig sites, doing her best not to fall into any of them. Some of them were well over 10 feet deeper than she'd already climbed to get down here in the first place. The ropes Jace had sent them with were strong, and she had her cell phone to call for help in the event she needed it. Still, there were at least 30 of the pits out here, close enough together that it felt nearly inevitable you'd fall in one even in the daytime. Tears pricked her eyes as she imagined her boys falling, but she blinked them back. No, she had to keep her head about her. Lord, help me focus. A soft breeze carried from the west, stopping her in her tracks with the smell of the forest. There was something else, too. There, kissing the breeze so low she'd have missed it if she'd kept moving, was the sound of something crying. Something calling out. Energized despite the long night, Lauren's eyes popped open as she tried to move in the direction of the sound. It had died down, so she stopped again with the hope of hearing it once more. "Come on," she muttered. Once again, the soft sound carried through the air once more. "Help! Brady! Ben!" She'd recognized the voice of her middle son anywhere, imprinted on her heart in its puberty-laden change. She could still hear his tiny toddler voice from years before, but every iteration of it was special in its own way. "Mommy!" That was Ben. He so rarely called her Mommy anymore, opting instead for just Mom, like his big brothers. Then his desperation was clear. "Mommy, we're over here." It took everything in her not to run towards the blessed sound, but her falling in another one of the pits would help no one. "I'm coming, boys." It took another 5 minutes to get to them going around all the obstacles in the way, but they kept calling as beacons in the night. There, in a pit around 8 feet deep, towards the very edge of the mine, stood her boys. The shining flashlight showed them covered in dirt and Brady cradling his left arm. Ben had a bruise on his cheek, but otherwise looked all right. "Boys," she sobbed as she fell to her knees. "You're all right." "Well," Ben said through his own tears. "I am. Brady hurt his arm trying to lift me out, but he didn't let me fall." "Oh, that beautiful, precious boy." Her middle son's face was pinched in pain, but the clear relief in his eyes at the knowledge their peril had come to an end nearly undid her. "Jeff's back there, guys. Let me call him, and we'll pull you two out. You're safe now." The oh-so-familiar and comforting voice sounded behind her. "I'm here." Robert and his crew were nearby, so they're waiting to lift us out. He dropped to his knees beside her, the stoic mountain of a man, moved to tears as well. "You two sure are a sight for sore eyes." Ben giggled, but Brady's face continued to show the clear pain of whatever he'd done to it. "Mr. Jeff, can you get Ben out first? I can try to help lift him with my good arm." Shaking his head, Jeff twisted to a sitting position there at the mouth of the hole. "Nope. I'm coming down to lift both of you out. With your mom pulling and me lifting, we'll have you out in no time. Shouldn't we wait for Robert? How are you going to get out?" Jeff shoved himself off the side and landed with a plunk to the right of the boys. "Guess we'll find out how effective my pull-ups are." An hour later, they'd made their way back to the retreat center site. Jace had already called back all the search parties, and all 50 or so people had been overjoyed to hear they'd been found relatively unharmed. Originally, the plan had been to take both of them to the hospital to be checked over, but Micah had graciously agreed to image Brady's arm and check them both for other injuries at his clinic in town. Harper had gone ahead with him to set everything up since it was still the wee hours of the morning, and the boys had both drunk a full bottle of water and eaten paninis from the bakery while Jace got the full story. "Yeah," Ben said as he took another bite of the sandwich. "The raccoon was limping really bad, so I followed him down the trail, but then he went off the trail. I figured I could find my way back." He grimaced, his first words devoid of 6-year-old confidence. "I couldn't." The corner of Jace's lip turned up. "I'm guessing Brady came after you?" "Yep," Brady answered. He'd said his pain was only 5 out of 10, but now the adrenaline was wearing off and he wasn't hungry. Jeff knew they were on borrowed time before he'd need some pain medication. "I saw him head off into the woods and didn't want him to get so far I couldn't find him. I was gonna tell him to get himself back to camp, but by the time I caught up to him, we'd gotten lost." Brady swore he knew how to get back, but he needs some lessons in or, "Mr. Jeff, what's that thing you taught us about the compasses?" "Orienteering," Jeff said through a chuckle. "I've only given you guys 2 lessons. I wouldn't expect him to be Bear Grylls yet. Ever reading her cubs, Lauren stepped forward and placed her hand on Brady's shoulder. Jace, I'll be happy to bring them down to the station in the morning, but we need to get this one's arm seen about. Can the interview be over tonight? Sure thing, and I think I have everything we need. Boys, we're so happy you're okay, but I'd really like to avoid another search and rescue operation any time within the next 10 years. No traipsing off into the woods alone. Got it? He was stern, but Jeff knew he was just as relieved as the rest of them that the boys were just fine. Yes, sir, they said in unison. Lauren helped Brady stand while Jeff dug for his keys in his pocket. You guys ready to go get some x-rays? Eyes wide, Brady jerked his face to Jeff's. You don't think I'll have to get a shot, do you? I can't promise anything, Jeff answered as he took the kid's hand. But I doubt it. With that, the four of them headed towards Jeff's truck, as Rhonda had already taken Will back to the shelter once they'd gotten word both boys were safe. He'd stayed long enough to hug them, but Lauren had insisted he get some rest. After all, the summer showcase for arts camp was in 2 days, and he'd come way too far in his combat choreography to freeze up due to exhaustion during their scene. As they got both boys situated in the back, Jeff led Lauren around to the passenger side and placed his hand on the door handle. Before he opened it, heedless of their audience of a smattering of police officers and 2 boys in the back seat, he leaned forward and pressed his lips to her forehead. How do you feel? Coming down after something like that can hit you like a truck. His free hand reached up, running the backs of his fingers down her cheek and tugging on a loose curl at her neck. I don't think it's all really hit me yet, she said softly. For the first time in probably my whole life, I feel peace. Leaning forward, Lauren wrapped her arms around his waist and buried her face in his chest. Only this time, there was no fear, no tears, only contentment and the knowledge the Lord had brought them through what could have been a disastrous situation. Jeff hugged her back, only releasing it a moment later to get Brady the pain medication he sorely needed. I'm so glad, honey, he said as he opened her door. You have no idea how much. As he walked back around the front of his truck, Jeff locked eyes with his brother where he'd just finished tossing the last of the bakery's disposable food dishes into the trash and tossed the bags in the back of Bree's Paws and Claws truck. We're going to take this to the dumpster by town hall so it doesn't attract bears, Hunter said as he gestured towards the old vehicle. It roared to life, the night too dark to see Bree behind the wheel. Oh, thanks. I hadn't even thought about that. Told Jace I'd take care of it, Hunter nodded. Bree wanted to help. You just go take care of your family, brother. We've got this covered. Family. It was what they'd become, and he wouldn't even try to deny it. Whether Lauren ever agreed to see him romantically, he was connected to this woman and her boys. Where the Lord would take them from here was anyone's guess, but he was pretty good at redeeming broken things. Jeff wouldn't try and do his job for him. Chapter 17. Lauren could barely stay in her seat at the arts camp summer showcase. Keely's girls and Sophia had danced their little hearts out. Brady had come so far with the percussion ensemble, even with his cast, and even Ben had dipped his toe in a myriad of different art mediums during the summer. His visual art piece, a painting which actually strikingly resembled the skunk he'd rescued earlier in the summer, was hung in the gallery they viewed on the way in. Honey, Jeff said with a grin as he placed a comforting hand on her bouncing knee. He's gonna be fine. He's practiced this choreography so many times he could probably do it in his sleep. He was right. Will had come so far that summer through his combat choreography training. He'd already done a couple of scenes out of different plays, his musical talent bringing tears to her eyes as he'd performed pieces from Fiddler on the Roof, Annie, and Les Miserables. He'd not done any solos, as those were reserved for older, more experienced students, but he'd given each scene and song everything he had. Now, it was time for their fight scene. I know you're right. I just worry. Jeff removed his hand from her knee and wrapped it around her shoulders. Pressing a calming kiss to the side of her head, he spoke softly. That's what makes you the mama bear, but he's ready. Surrender isn't weakness. It's strength. It would probably take the rest of her life to surrender her children to the Lord, but truly it was the only way she'd ever have peace as they navigated the twists and turns of life. The amphitheater at the retreat center was nearly full, with close to 200 parents and friends there to see the kids perform. It was a beautiful night, the sunset falling gently behind the same woods which had nearly taken so much from her mere days ago. Ben didn't even appear to have any lingering anxiety about the whole thing, and Brady had only needed a couple doses of the stronger pain medication after he'd gotten his cast. She'd tried to convince him to drop out of the percussion ensemble pieces, but they'd compromised and he'd performed one of the two. The stage lights went down again, not totally dimming the sight due to the time of day, but creating an effect nonetheless. By the time they'd been brought back up, Lauren immediately spotted Wilder peeking out from backstage, ready to perform their scene from West Side Story. "Wait," Lauren said as she thought about this particular scene from the movie. "Why isn't he up there?" The two gangs had lined up on either side of the stage, their leaders arguing while Will waited behind a makeshift chain-link fence. Oh no. Her heart sank at the thought Will hadn't been able to make himself go on stage. A lump formed in her throat until Jeff squeezed her shoulder. "No, it's not his cue yet." "What do you dash?" "SSH, Jeff said with a wink. "Watch." The arguing between the leaders of the gangs exploded until Will burst out from his hiding spot, and he jumped the fence. See? The lump she'd had in her throat a moment before was nothing compared to the realization he'd landed the lead role. He was Tony, doing his best to choose love over violence despite the darkness of his past. Will's violent past wasn't of his own doing, but as he stared down at his fists in realization, he embodied the character of Tony so beautifully. He had no Maria at home waiting on him, but he knew enough to know it would never be the answer. In the movie she'd seen as a teenager, this scene had always come across as a little cheesy, but the choreography the boys did on stage was moving and electric. When Riff, Tony's friend, refused to back down from the fight and ultimately lost his life, the anguish on Will's face was so believable she couldn't look away. He was no longer Will, her little boy on the cusp of manhood. He'd embodied his character with both respect to the words on the page and his own unique spin. By the time the scene ended, the whole crowd had leapt to their feet. Will's eyes caught Lauren's as he and the others in the scene bowed before bringing out the rest of the students who'd all worked so hard on such a wonderful performance. The only person who might have clapped harder than Lauren was Jeff, the man she realized had filled a father role in her boys' lives slowly and quietly. He'd always respected her as their mother, but as he took her hand in his, Lauren saw Will nod at the man next to her. "He's thanking you for everything you've done." "It was my pleasure," Jeff replied. "That's not what he's saying. He thanked me before we came tonight. That look was about the chat he had with me about my relationship with you." Lauren's mouth dropped open. "What chat?" Jeff grinned, his face full of mischief. "He rightfully wanted to know my intentions with his mother. He's protective of you and trying to find his way into a role he's too young for but has done his best to fill anyway." It was true. Will had done more and more over the last year to try and help her out with the younger boys, but she'd done her best to protect the last wisps of his childhood if she could. "What did you say?" "Your intentions, I mean." Her heart beat faster, but the nerves fell away when Jeff turned her towards him and pressed his forehead to hers. "They're to prove to you every day for the rest of your life you're worth it all. You're worth the love of a man who adores you, and so are your boys. It's to lead you and the family we'll have in faith, and teach the boys what it means to be a man of God. I know you're still a brand new Christian, and I have no intentions of rushing that growth. I want you to know I'm in. I'm all in, and I'll be here as long as you'll have me. With every breath I'm given, I'll tell you I love you in both words and action. With every heartbeat, I'll cherish the gift of you and our boys." With that, he closed the distance between their lips, the applause still sounding around them. As he pulled back, Lauren allowed the inevitable smile to spread over her face. "I think I could get on board with that." After the showcase, the kids all stayed behind for their cast party of pizza and ice cream. Rhonda said she'd bring all the kids home, so Keely and Gloria had gone to the grocery store to stock up on a few things while Jeff drove himself, Lauren, Hunter, and Bree back to the shelter since Bree had her car parked there. "I really wouldn't have minded taking you home, Bree," Jeff said to the woman in his back seat. "I guess you'd be in a pickle tomorrow morning without your car." Bree smiled oddly, like it strained her somehow. Why, yeah. My house is out of the way anyway. Hunter's brow furrowed. I thought you said you lived off Main Street. Isn't that why you didn't let me drive you home after lunch at the resort? They'd been to lunch? When? Jeff must have been so preoccupied with Lauren and the boys he'd completely missed that detail of his brother's life. Lauren bit her lip beside him, her mouth pinched in what was clearly discomfort. Rather than force the poor girl to answer what had apparently been a brush-off, Jeff changed the subject. I can't believe how well they all did tonight. I thought for sure Ben's arm would have at least smarted during his drum feature, but he didn't miss a beat. Bree jumped on the new topic, leaning forward in her seat. And Will with his West Side Story scene. That's one of my favorite musicals. Flicking his eyes up to the rearview mirror, Jeff noticed his brother's stiff demeanor. He didn't like being lied to, but even Jeff could tell there was more to Bree's story than what any of them knew. Was it a simple brush-off, or was there more? He'd barely come to a stop in the Paws and Claws parking lot when Bree jumped out and pulled her keys from her pocket. Thanks for the ride. I've got to go do evening rounds on the animals. Lauren opened her door as well. I'll help you. Guys, if you two want to stay in the truck, we'll be done in a few minutes. The two women exchanged some sort of look Jeff couldn't decipher before Lauren followed her boss to unlock the door. The glass had only shut behind them when Jeff spoke up. So, were you going to tell me about going on a date with Brianna? It wasn't a date, Hunter said as he ran a hand down his face. We ran into each other in town yesterday, and I thought it was going great until I offered to drive her home. She got all cagey, so I dropped the subject. Now I feel like I need to know where she lives. She said she lived on Main Street and preferred to walk, but we just drove past there. Well, her car was here. Maybe that's what she meant. Hunter's eyes met his in the mirror. Yeah, I'd believe that if she didn't act so suspicious about it. How much do you know about her? Not a whole lot. She's a good boss to Lauren, but that's pretty much all I know. Look, rather than stewing over this, why don't we offer to go in and help them? Even if we're scooping the cages, you might get the chance to get to know her better. She may be really security conscious. After a lifetime together, Jeff knew his brother was like a dog with a bone when he thought someone might be in trouble or pose a threat to someone he cared about. Because Jeff cared about Lauren, so did Hunter. Therefore, he'd make sure there was nothing and no one in their orbit who could cause them harm. It was what he did, who he was, and how he was wired. Sure, Hunter grumbled as he opened the door. She's been weird with me ever since. I feel like she's avoiding me. Dude, she just sat beside you at the showcase. I think you're reading too much into all this. Which was true, but Jeff couldn't help but think there might be more to the story as well. Why don't you try and talk to her? Tell her you're sorry for coming on strong about where she lives. She barely knows you. The bell over the front door jingled as they moved inside, the telltale smell of animal dander, pet food, and other less pleasant odors in the air. It didn't smell bad. The women kept things too clean for that, but so many animals were bound to carry some sort of a must. Lauren? Bree? Lauren's voice sounded from the health checkup room where they bathed and provided wellness exams for all their animals. In here, Brianna's in the back cleaning cages. Clapping his hand on his brother's back, Jeff gestured down the back hallway. Sounds like a perfect opportunity to start over to me. With a deep breath, his brother started down the hall with a mock salute. Here goes nothing. As Hunter set off down the hallway, Jeff found the woman who'd occupied so much of his thoughts for over a year. She scrubbed down a giant mastiff with shaking legs and dark brown eyes. Who's this big guy? Pause right there, Lauren said softly. This is Bruno, and I'm the only one he's let get close to him since he came here. Bruno, this is Jeff. He's one of the good ones. Pressing a kiss to the dog's head, Lauren finished rinsing him as the water went down the drain in the middle of the floor. That's it, buddy. You're doing great. I'm going to get a towel now and dry you off. Jeff had stopped where instructed, not quite in the doorway of the clinic room. Bruno stared at him, but he didn't look terrified as Jeff might have imagined. Still, his legs shook and his eyes were wide. Would it help if I squatted? Probably. We're not sure if the bulk of his abuse was from males or females, but statistically it's more likely to be males. She ran a towel down the dog's back. He'll never have to deal with that again, will he? She spoke in a sweet voice to the dog. No, because when he's ready, he's coming home with me. In that case, we'd better get comfortable with one another. Facing Bruno, Jeff smiled. Because one day, I plan to meet this lady at the end of a church aisle and go home with her too. You chose good, big guy. She's the best. Lauren had just turned to him with a slight gasp at his forwardness when Hunter's deep voice shouted from the back hallway. You're living here? Bruno cowered, and Lauren's eyes squeezed shut. There it is. It's okay, buddy. Everyone's fine. Standing, Lauren latched Bruno's harness to a hook on the wall. I'll be right back, okay, bud? The dog sat, at least no longer shaking. She pulled a handful of treats from a bowl on the counter and placed a few at his feet. Then, with a deep sigh, Lauren led the two of them through the shelter and down the hallway. Hunter stood with his arms crossed and his jaw as tense as Jeff had ever seen it. Get your stuff. You can't stay in an animal shelter. I'll pay to put you up in a rental somewhere. Brianna's eyes flashed. You think you can waltz in here and tell me what to do? Newsflash, I've been taking care of myself and everyone else for a long time now. I don't need some hotshot lawyer from the city thinking he can come in and bark orders to get his way. Taking care of everyone? You're sleeping on a cot on the floor in your office. All you have is a microwave and a mini fridge. How is that taking care of yourself? His voice was still raised, and the energy of the dog's back here had risen to levels Jeff knew wouldn't work out well for his brother if any of them managed to break free of their cages. Hunt, let's go. This is her business. Jeff grabbed his brother's arm, all but shoving him towards the door. You're making a fool of yourself. Lauren followed after them a moment later, clearly having checked on her friend first. It was the first moment Jeff realized she hadn't cowered at the sound of his brother yelling, though if she had, Jeff would likely have laid him out himself. My 6-year-old can handle his temper better than that, Hunter. She seethed, and his brother deserved it. You two go to the car. I'm going to get Bruno put up for the night, and then you're not coming anywhere near Brianna until she says you can. Firmly put in his place by a woman half his size, Hunter at least had the decency to look ashamed. Yeah, I get it. Later that evening, after they dropped Hunter off at Jeff's to wallow in the shame of his own bad choices, Jeff drove Lauren back to the women's shelter and punched in the gate code. You knew she was sleeping in there, didn't you? I work there, Lauren said with a chuckle devoid of mirth. Of course I knew. We could help her, Jeff said carefully. If she wants it, that is. Lauren reached over the console and placed her hand in his. You've got a good heart, Jefferson Banks. I offered the help, and she knows it's an open invitation. Honestly, I've been the one with nothing, and it hurts the pride to have to accept help. I don't know why she's in the mess she's in, but Hunter barging in there like that pretty much ruined any chance there is of her doing so anytime this millennium. As he pulled the truck to a park, Jeff reached over with his free hand and cupped her cheek. You've got a good heart too, Lauren Rafferty. The best heart. But your fire? That may be as beautiful in my eyes. You put my brother in his place the way only a mom can. Lauren grinned, the sight still one to send eagles flying through his gut. He deserved it. Leaning forward, Jeff pressed his lips to hers for just a moment. Now, how about a walk before the boys get back? It's a full moon tonight. Sounds perfect. Thanks for listening. It would mean so much if you'd subscribe and leave a comment if you like my books.